The worst storms always came without warning. Harriet Calloway learned that truth the hard way, standing knee-deep in Montana snow, while her rented horse screamed and thrashed against leather reins she could barely hold. Wind cut through her wool coat like it was tissue paper. Ice crystals stung her face. The trail she'd been following, if it had ever really been there, had vanished under white drifts that looked the same in every direction. "Oh, easy," she gasped, but the mare heard only terror in her voice. "Please, just—" The horse reared. Harriet's gloved hands slipped. She stumbled backward into a snowbank that swallowed her to the waist, and by the time she clawed her way upright, the mare was gone. Just hoofbeats fading into the howl of wind, then nothing. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone in the worst blizzard she'd ever seen, miles from Black Hollow, with darkness coming fast. Harriet's breath came in short bursts that clouded the air before her face. Her heart hammered. She turned in a slow circle, searching for any landmark, any sign of the path back to town. Trees, snow, gray sky pressing down like a coffin lid. That was all. "You stupid, stupid woman," she whispered. Because that's what they'd all said, wasn't it? The boarding house owner in Chicago who'd looked her up and down before quoting triple the usual rate. The man at the train station who'd laughed when she asked about buying passage west. Her Aunt Eleanor, who'd taken her in after the fire that killed her parents, but made sure Harriet understood it was charity, not love. A girl your size has no business chasing dreams. You should be grateful for what you can get. Well, she'd gotten herself killed, apparently. 3 days in Montana and she was going to freeze to death in the mountains because she'd been too proud to hire a guide. Too stubborn to accept that maybe the frontier wasn't meant for women who didn't fit the mold. Women who were too heavy, too soft, too wrong. The cold bit deeper. Harriet forced herself to move, to wade through drifts that grabbed at her skirts and boots. Her legs burned. Sweat soaked her back despite the freezing air, and she knew that was bad. New wet clothes in this cold meant death. But she couldn't stop. If she stopped, she'd never get up again. How long did she walk? An hour? 3? Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the next step, and the next, and the voice in her head that sounded like her aunt. This is what happens when fat girls try to be heroes. Harriet's foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. She pitched forward, hands breaking her fall, and when she tried to stand, her right ankle screamed. Pain shot up her leg, bright and hot. "No." The word came out small. "No, please. Not now. So..." She managed 3 more steps before the ankle gave out completely. She went down hard, landing in snow so deep it came up past her shoulders. For a long moment she just lay there, chest heaving, while the wind screamed overhead. "Get up," her mind ordered. "Get up or die here." But her body wouldn't listen anymore. The cold had worked into her bones. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. When she tried to move her legs, they barely responded. This was it then. This was how Harriet Calloway's story ended, frozen in the Montana wilderness, unmissed and unmourned, another fool who thought she could outrun her past. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in the storm, something howled. Not wind, something alive. Harriet's eyes snapped open. That sound came again, closer now, and it dragged ice down her spine because she recognized it from stories she'd heard in Black Hollow's saloon. Wolves. A pack of them from the sound of it, and they'd caught her scent. Terror gave her strength she didn't know she had left. She dragged herself upright, grabbed a fallen branch thick as her wrist, and pressed her back against the nearest tree. The howling grew louder. Shapes moved in the white chaos, low and fast. "Come on then," Harriet said through chattering teeth. "Come on." Maybe it was better than freezing. Maybe... A gunshot cracked across the mountainside. The wolves scattered, their howls turning to yelps. Another shot. Then hoofbeats, heavy and deliberate, coming straight toward her through the storm. Harriet raised her branch with shaking hands, though she knew it was useless. She couldn't even see who was coming. Could be anyone. Could be worse than wolves. A massive horse materialized from the snow, dark as midnight. On its back sat a man who looked carved from the mountain itself. Broad-shouldered, tall, wearing a heavy coat crusted with ice. A rifle rested across his saddle. His face was shadowed by his hat, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, the weathered skin, the way he sat his horse like he'd been born to it. He looked down at her without speaking. Harriet tightened her grip on the branch, though her arms shook so badly she could barely hold it. I don't want trouble. The man's eyes. She could see them now, gray as the storm, moved from her face to the branch, to her snow-covered clothes, to the way she favored her left leg, taking inventory, making assessments. You already got trouble, he said finally. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. Question is whether you want to keep it. I can manage. That right? He didn't sound mocked, just tired. Which way's town? Harriet opened her mouth, closed it. She had no idea which way was anything anymore. The man nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. You got maybe an hour before you lose your toes, maybe less. He shifted in his saddle. I got a cabin 2 miles north. You can make it there, get warm, wait out the storm, or you can keep managing. I don't know you. No, you don't. How do I know you won't? She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice all the warnings she'd heard about men on the frontier. What they did to women alone. Women nobody cared about. Something that might have been understanding crossed his weathered face. You don't, he said simply. But the wolves know where you are now. They'll circle back soon as I leave, and that ankle won't carry you far. He was right. Harriet knew he was right. She could barely stand, barely think through the cold that had worked into her skull. What's your name? She asked. He hesitated, like even that was something dangerous to give away. Rhett Maddox. The name meant nothing to her. She was too new to Black Hollow to know its ghosts. Harriet Calloway. Rhett nodded once, then urged his horse closer and extended his hand. You get one chance to decide, Miss Calloway. After that, I'm gone. Harriet looked at his hand, looked at the storm closing in, looked at the shape still moving at the edge of visibility, waiting. She dropped the branch and grabbed his hand. His grip was iron strong. He hauled her up behind him with an ease that should have embarrassed her, another reminder of how heavy she was, how much space she took up. But there was nothing mocking in how he did it, just efficient, necessary. Hold on, he said. She wrapped her arms around his waist and held tight as the horse turned into the storm. The cabin appeared like a ghost, sudden and half buried in snow at the base of a sheer rock face. Rhett dismounted first, then helped Harriet down. Her ankle screamed when her boot hit the ground. She bit back a cry. Inside, Rhett said, already moving to stable his horse under a lean-to attached to the cabin's east wall. Doors open. Harriet limped to the entrance and pushed inside. The cabin was small, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a bed frame in the corner piled with furs. But it was shelter. Real shelter, with walls that blocked the wind and a roof that held back the snow. She stood dripping on the floorboards, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Rhett came in behind her carrying wood from somewhere outside. He moved past her without a word, knelt at the fireplace, and built a fire with quick, practiced movements. Within minutes, flames were crackling, throwing heat and light across the small space. Sit, he said, nodding at the chair. Harriet wanted to argue, to say she was fine standing, but her legs gave out and she sank into the chair before she could stop herself. Rhett pulled a blanket from somewhere and draped it over her shoulders, then disappeared outside again. He returned with what looked like a medical kit. Battered tin box, white cloth spilling from its edges. The ankle, he said, kneeling. Need to see it. I can. You can't. He looked up at her, those gray eyes steady. Boots frozen to your foot. You try to pull it yourself, you'll do more damage. Let me. There was no command in his voice. No impatience, just fact. Harriet nodded slowly. Rhett worked in silence, carefully loosening the ice-crusted laces, easing the boot off with movements so gentle she barely felt pain. When he peeled back her stocking, Jesus, Mary, the stocking was half frozen too, she saw her ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, mottled purple and black. Sprained, Rhett said. Maybe fractured. Hard to tell without... He stopped himself. It'll need wrapping. Ice first, then heat rotation. Keep it elevated. You've done this before. Mountains don't forgive mistakes. He stood, moved to the corner, came back with what looked like a piece of oilcloth and a handful of snow from outside. He made a crude ice pack and pressed it against her ankle. This'll hurt. It did. Harriet hissed through her teeth. Good, Rhett said. Means the foot's still alive. He worked methodically. Ice, then cloth wrapping, then propping her leg on an overturned crate he dragged from somewhere. While he did that, Harriet studied him. Up close, she could see the scar tissue running along his left jaw, disappearing into his collar. Old burns, maybe. Or something worse. His hands were scarred too, knuckles thick with old breaks. A hard man, built by hard years. When he finished with her ankle, he moved to the fire and hung her wet coat near the flames. Then he pulled off his own coat, revealing a worn flannel shirt and suspenders. He rolled up his sleeves, retrieved a pot from a shelf, and headed back outside. He returned with the pot full of snow, which he set on a hook over the fire to melt. Then he pulled dried meat and hard bread from a tin on the shelf. "You need food," he said, setting it on the table. "Warm liquid, too, when the water's hot." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. "You saved my life." Rhett glanced at her, then away. "You saved your own life by accepting help. Most folks are too proud." "I was about to be too dead to be proud." That got something that might have been a smile, just a slight pull at the corner of his mouth, gone almost immediately. "Fair point." The pot began to steam. Rhett pulled it off the fire, poured some of the hot water into a tin cup, and handed it to Harriet. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "How long have you been in Black Hollow?" Rhett asked, settling onto the floor near the fire with his back against the wall. Not close. Giving her space. 3 days. His eyebrows rose slightly. "And you came up into the mountains alone?" "I wanted to see them." It sounded stupid saying it out loud. "Everyone in town talked about how beautiful they were, how dangerous. I thought—" She stopped. What had she thought? That proving she could handle the frontier would somehow make her belong here? That conquering a mountain would erase 24 years of being told she was wrong? Thought what? Rhett's voice was quiet. "That I could handle it," Harriet admitted. "That I wasn't as weak as everyone always said." Rhett was silent for a long moment, watching the fire. "Coming up here alone in winter without a guide wasn't weak, it was stupid. There's a difference." Harriet blinked. Then, despite everything, she laughed. It burst out of her, sharp and startled. Rhett looked at her, confused. "Sorry," Harriet managed. "It's just, you're the first person who's called me stupid instead of fragile. It's almost refreshing. Fragile." Rhett said the word like it tasted bad. "You walked miles through a blizzard on a busted ankle. That ain't fragile." Something warm uncurled in Harriet's chest, something that had nothing to do with the fire or the hot water. "What brought you west?" Rhett asked after a pause. The question was casual, but Harriet heard the weight behind it. The real question, what are you running from? "My parents died 2 years ago," she said. "House fire in Chicago. I went to live with my aunt after that, but she made it clear I was a burden. When I turned 24 last month, she told me I needed to find my own way." Harriet stared into her cup. "I had some money saved. Not much, but enough for a train ticket and a few weeks' room and board. I thought maybe out here, where everything's new, I could be new too." And I've been in Black Hollow 3 days, and I've already heard the whispers. About how I don't look like frontier material, about how I should probably head back east before winter really sets in. She met his eyes. "Apparently I'm too soft for Montana." Rhett's expression didn't change. "People say a lot of things." "Do you think I'm too soft?" "I think you're sitting in my cabin instead of dead in the snow, which means you're smarter than you are soft." He stood, added another log to the fire. "But if you go back up that mountain unprepared, alone, trying to prove something, you'll be dead. And dead's got nothing to do with soft or hard, just stupid." Harriet absorbed that. "So what do I do?" "You learn." Rhett moved to the window, peered out at the storm. "You find someone who knows the mountains, and you listen. You respect the wilderness instead of fighting it, and you stop caring what people whisper." Easy to say. Didn't say it was easy. He turned back to her. "But you got 2 choices, Miss Calloway. You can spend your life trying to prove you're something you're not, or you can figure out what you actually are and build from there." "And what am I?" Rhett studied her for a long moment. "Don't know yet. But you didn't give up out there. Even when the wolves came. That's worth something." The storm howled outside. Inside, the fire crackled. Harriet felt exhaustion pulling at her, the warmth and safety making her body realize just how close she'd come to dying. "The storm won't break until morning," Rhett said. You should sleep. I'll keep the fire going. Where will you sleep? He nodded at the floor. Here's fine. That's not. You saved my life. You should take the bed. Bed's yours. I've slept in worse places. He settled back against the wall, that same comfortable ease. Besides, someone needs to watch your ankle. Swelling gets worse. You'll need different treatment. Harriet wanted to argue, but she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She limped to the bed, sank into the furs, and within moments, sleep dragged her under. Boy! She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window. The storm had quieted to occasional gusts. Her ankle throbbed, but less viciously than before. Rhett was gone. Panic flared until she heard movement outside, the sound of an axe biting wood. She sat up carefully, testing her ankle. Still swollen, still painful, but she could put some weight on it now. The cabin door opened. Rhett came in carrying firewood, saw her awake, and nodded. How's the foot? Better. Good. Storm's breaking. I can get you back to town in a few hours if the trails are clear. Something in Harriet's chest sank. Of course. This was temporary. A rescue, nothing more. Rhett Maddox didn't know her, didn't owe her anything beyond getting her back to civilization. Thank you, she said, for everything. He just nodded and started building up the fire again. They ate a quiet breakfast. More dried meat, hard bread softened in hot water, and then Rhett helped her onto his horse. The ride down the mountain was slow, careful. Rhett navigated trails Harriet couldn't even see, reading the landscape like a book. Black Hollow appeared below them, smoke rising from chimneys, the town waking up to a world buried in fresh snow. I can walk from here, Harriet said when they reached the town's edge. You can barely stand. People will talk if they see me riding with you. Rhett went still. They talk anyway. What do you mean? He didn't answer, just urged the horse forward into town. Harriet felt eyes on them immediately. People stopped shoveling snow from their porches to stare. A woman clutched her shawl tighter and hurried inside. Two men outside the saloon watched them pass with expressions Harriet couldn't read. Rhett rode straight to the boarding house where Harriet had rented a room. He dismounted, helped her down, and walked her to the door. Mrs. Crawford, the boarding house owner, opened it before they could knock. Her eyes went wide when she saw Rhett. Miss Calloway, she said sharply, where have you been? You've been gone since yesterday afternoon. I got caught in the storm, Harriet said. Mr. Maddox found me and… Mr. Maddox. Mrs. Crawford's voice turned cold. She looked at Rhett like he was something diseased. I see. She needs rest, Rhett said flatly. And her ankle needs tending. She should see a doctor. I'll take care of Miss Calloway. Mrs. Crawford stepped between them, physically blocking Rhett from the door. Thank you for bringing her back. The dismissal was clear, brutal. Rhett's jaw tightened, but he just touched his hat brim and turned to leave. Wait, Harriet said. I wanted to… But he was already walking away, leading his horse back toward the edge of town, toward the mountains. Mrs. Crawford grabbed Harriet's arm and pulled her inside. Do you have any idea what you've done? He saved my life. He's Rhett Maddox, Mrs. Crawford hissed. The man's dangerous. Everyone knows it. He was nothing but kind to me. Kind? Mrs. Crawford laughed harshly. Girl, you've been here 3 days. You don't know anything about this town or the people in it. That man… She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. Just stay away from him, for your own good. But as Harriet lay in her rented bed that night, ankle propped and throbbing, she couldn't stop thinking about the scarred rancher who'd pulled her from the storm. The man who'd called her stupid instead of weak. The man who'd looked at her like she was a person instead of a problem. And she wondered what exactly it was that made a whole town afraid of Rhett Maddox, and why she wasn't afraid at all. But 2 days passed. Harriet's ankle healed slowly. She spent most of her time in her room, avoiding the pointed looks and whispered conversations that seemed to follow her whenever she ventured downstairs. On the third morning, she couldn't take it anymore. She dressed carefully, wrapped her ankle tight, and limped downstairs to the boarding house's small dining room where Mrs. Crawford served breakfast to her tenants. The room went quiet when Harriet entered. 4 other women sat at the table, all younger than Mrs. Crawford, all dressed in proper frontier fashion, all staring at Harriet like she'd grown a second head. "Miss Calloway," Mrs. Crawford said stiffly, "you should be resting." "I've rested enough." Harriet took a seat, ignoring the pain in her ankle. "I need to start looking for work." One of the women, blonde, pretty, wearing a dress that actually fit, laughed. "Work? Doing what?" "Whatever's available," Harriet said evenly. "I can cook, clean, keep books. Maybe you should have thought about employment before spending the night in Rhett Maddox's cabin," another woman said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Harriet's hands tightened in her lap. "I was lost in a blizzard. He saved my life." "I'm sure he did." The blonde woman smiled. "And I'm sure he was a perfect gentleman the entire time, just like he was with that rancher he killed 5 years ago." Harriet's breath caught. "What?" "Oh, she doesn't know." The blonde woman leaned forward. "Didn't he tell you? Rhett Maddox murdered a man during a robbery. Shot him in cold blood over a cattle dispute. He would have hanged for it too, but there wasn't enough evidence. So now he just lives up in those mountains, and decent people stay clear." "That's not—" Harriet started, but her voice faltered. Because what did she know? She'd spent one night in Rhett's cabin. One night didn't tell you who a person really was. "Emily's right," Mrs. Crawford said quietly. "Rhett Maddox is dangerous. He's been nothing but trouble since he came to this valley. And the fact that he hasn't been run out yet is only because he stays in those mountains and keeps to himself." She looked at Harriet with something that might have been pity. "I know he helped you, dear, but association with that man will ruin what little chance you have of making a life here." "What little chance?" Harriet repeated. Mrs. Crawford's expression shifted, uncomfortable, caught. "I only mean that you're new here and people talk and a woman needs to be careful about her reputation." "You mean a woman like me?" Harriet stood, pain lancing through her ankle. "A fat woman who nobody wants anyway, so she better not make it worse by associating with the wrong people." "That's not what I said." "But it's what you meant." Harriet turned and limped out of the dining room, out of the boarding house, into the cold morning air. She stood on the porch, breathing hard, shaking with anger and humiliation and something else she couldn't name. A woman like her. They kept saying it like everyone understood, like it was obvious that Harriet Calloway, with her heavy frame and plain face, should be grateful for whatever scraps life threw her way. Well, she was done being grateful. She was done shrinking. And she was done letting other people define what she deserved. Harriet looked toward the mountains, where snow still clung to the peaks, and morning light painted everything gold. Somewhere up there, Rhett Maddox was starting his day, probably unaware that he'd become the subject of boarding house gossip. Maybe he was dangerous. Maybe he'd killed a man. Maybe everything they said was true. But he'd also pulled her from a blizzard when he could have ridden past. He'd tended her ankle with careful hands. He'd called her stupid instead of fragile, and somehow that had felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in years. Harriet made a decision. She went back inside, gathered her few belongings, and paid Mrs. Crawford for the week. Then she limped to Black Hollow's general store and asked about work. The owner, a weathered man named Sykes, looked her up and down with unconcealed skepticism. "You got experience?" "I can learn." "This ain't Chicago, girl. Work here is hard." "Then I'll work hard." Something in her tone made him pause. He studied her face, then shrugged. "I need someone to manage inventory, keep the books, handle customers when I'm making deliveries. Pays not much, but it includes a room above the store." "I'll take it." Sykes blinked. "You don't want to know how much—" "I'll take it," Harriet repeated. And just like that, she had a job, a place to live, a reason to stay. The work was hard, just like Sykes had warned. Harriet spent her days hauling crates, organizing shelves, learning the peculiar economy of a frontier town where bullets and flour held equal value. Her ankle screamed for the first week, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. The room above the store was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was hers. Nobody could take it away as long as she did her job. And slowly, grudgingly, Black Hollow started to accept her presence. She wasn't liked exactly. The town women still watched her with a mixture of pity and disdain. But she was useful, and on the frontier, useful mattered more than liked. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Harriet was organizing the store's back room when the bell above the front door chimed. She heard Sykes's voice, tense. "Maddox!" Harriet froze. "Need supplies," Rhett's rough voice answered. "Standard order." "Sure. Give me a minute to pull it together." Harriet moved to the doorway and looked out. Rhett stood at the counter, hat in hand, snow melting off his coat. He looked the same, scarred, weathered, unmovable. He saw her and went still. "Miss Calloway." "Mr. Maddox." Sykes glanced between them, eyebrows raised, but said nothing. He disappeared into the stockroom to gather Rhett's order. Silence stretched. Harriet stepped out from the back room, limping only slightly now. "Your ankle healed," Rhett observed. "Mostly." She moved closer. "I wanted to thank you again, properly. I didn't get the chance before." "No need." "There's every need. You saved my life." Rhett's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to say something, stopped himself, then finally spoke in a low voice. "You should know people are talking about you being in my cabin. I know. It'll hurt your reputation." "I don't have much of a reputation to hurt." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe. "Still, this town, they don't forget. Association with me will make your life harder." "My life's already hard," Harriet met his eyes. "And I don't care what they say. You helped me when no one else would. I won't pretend that didn't happen just because it makes people uncomfortable." Rhett stared at her. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, "You're stubborn." "I prefer determined." That got the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough." Sykes returned with a box of supplies. Rhett paid, took the box, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Miss Calloway?" "Yes?" "If you ever want to learn the mountains the right way, I run cattle through the North Pass every few weeks. Could use an extra hand who's willing to learn." Harriet's heart jumped. "I don't know anything about cattle." "You didn't know anything about surviving blizzards either. You learned." He left before she could respond. Sykes whistled low. "Well, that's interesting." "What is?" "Rhett Maddox don't offer help to anyone, ever. Must have seen something in you up on that mountain." Harriet touched the counter, steadying herself. "What do people say he did? The man he supposedly killed?" Sykes's expression darkened. "Cattle rancher named Donovan. Rich man, powerful family. There was a dispute over water rights. Donovan tried to block Maddox's access to the creek that runs through his property. Donovan ended up shot. Maddox was the only other person there." He shrugged. "No witnesses, no proof, but everyone knows it was him." "Did Maddox confess?" "Never said a word about it, but he didn't deny it either." Harriet absorbed this. A killer. That's what they said Rhett Maddox was. A cold-blooded killer who'd murdered a man over water and gotten away with it. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was his careful hands wrapping her ankle, his quiet voice telling her she wasn't weak, just stupid. The way he'd given her his bed and slept on the floor without complaint. A killer wouldn't do that. Would he? What? Harriet went to the North Pass 2 weeks later. She told herself it was because she needed to learn the land if she was going to survive here. She told herself it had nothing to do with wanting to see Rhett again, to understand the man behind the rumors. She told herself a lot of things. The trail was easier to follow in the lighter snow, and this time Harriet came prepared. Proper boots, heavy coat, supplies in her pack. Her ankle held. She made it to the pass by midday. Rhett was already there with a small herd of cattle, maybe 20 head, moving them down from higher pastures before the next storm hit. He saw her approaching and reined his horse around. "You came," he said. "You invited me." He nodded slowly. "Can you ride?" "Not well." "You'll learn." He dismounted, moved to a pack horse trailing behind, and pulled out a saddle. "There's a mare in my string that's steady. She'll teach you better than I can." Over the next 4 hours, Harriet learned more about ranching than she'd learned about anything in her life. Rhett taught her to read cattle movement, to anticipate where they'd break from the herd, to use the horse's weight and positioning instead of fighting it. He was patient, demanding, but patient. When she made mistakes, and she made plenty, he corrected without mockery. When she did something right, he acknowledged it with a simple nod. By the time they finished moving the herd to lower ground, Harriet was exhausted, sore, and exhilarated. "You're a natural," Rhett said as they rode back toward his ranch. "I fell off twice." "Everyone falls. You got back on." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Harriet asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Did you kill that man? Donovan?" Rhett didn't flinch, didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Why do you want to know?" "Because if I'm going to keep coming up here, keep learning from you, I need to know who you are." "And if I say yes?" Harriet considered. "Then I'd want to know why." Rhett was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Donovan tried to cut off my water access in summer. Without that creek, my cattle die, my ranch dies. I'd be ruined." He paused. "I told him I'd fight it, legal-like, through the territorial courts. He laughed, said no judge would rule against his family. And 2 days later, he showed up at my property line with hired guns, told me I had a week to clear out, or they'd burn me out." Rhett's hands tightened on the reins. "I went to Sheriff Keller. He said it was a civil matter, nothing he could do. I went to the other ranchers. They said Donovan's family had too much power. Fighting them was suicide." "So what did you do?" "I went to Donovan's ranch at dawn, alone, unarmed. I told him I wouldn't leave my land, but I'd work out a water-sharing agreement if he'd negotiate in good faith." Rhett's voice went flat. "He pulled a gun on me, said the only agreement was me gone or me dead." Harriet's chest tightened. "So I took the gun away from him," Rhett continued, "and I left. Went back to my ranch. That night someone shot Donovan from distance. Professional work. 1 bullet, clean kill. They found him at dawn." "But you were the suspect." "I was the only suspect. I'd threatened him. I had motive, and I'd been the last person to see him alive as far as anyone knew." Rhett finally looked at her. "Sheriff Keller tried to pin it on me. Couldn't. No weapon, no witnesses, no proof. But the whole town decided I'd done it anyway. Been that way ever since." "Did you?" "No. Simple. Final. But I know who did." Harriet waited. "Donovan's brother hired someone," Rhett said. "Family inheritance dispute. With Donovan dead, the brother got the ranch. Everyone was so busy blaming me, nobody looked at the actual evidence." He shrugged. "Suited them fine. I was the outsider. Easy to hate." "Why didn't you tell them?" "Who'd believe me? And even if they did..." He stopped his horse, turned to face her fully. "I'm not interested in being accepted by people who decided what I was before they knew me. I built my life up in these mountains because I don't need their approval. Don't want it." Harriet understood that more than he probably knew. "So why help me?" she asked. "Why teach me?" Rhett studied her face for a long moment. "Because you didn't decide what I was before you knew me. And because..." He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. "Because you reminded me what it's like to be judged for things that don't matter." "Like?" "Like being big instead of small. Like taking up space instead of disappearing. Like being different from what they expect." His eyes held hers. "I've seen 100 men come west thinking they're tough enough for the frontier. Most of them break or quit within a year. But you damn near died, and you came back. That's worth something." Warmth spread through Harriet's chest. Not embarrassment, not pity, but something else. Recognition. Like finding someone who spoke a language she'd thought she was the only one who knew. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me." "And I believe you." Rhett blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Something shifted in his expression. Walls coming down just a fraction. "You're either very trusting or very stupid. Maybe both." Harriet smiled. "But you already said I was stupid, so at least I'm consistent." That got a real smile. Small, but genuine. "I did say that, didn't I?" "You did." Refreshingly honest. They rode on, and Harriet felt something settle in her chest. A decision made, a line crossed. She didn't care what Black Hollow thought of Rhett Maddox. She knew what she thought, and for the first time in her life, that was enough. Winter tightened its grip on Black Hollow over the following weeks, and Harriet settled into a rhythm she'd never expected to find. Days at the general store, learning Sykes's inventory system and dealing with customers who ranged from polite to outright hostile. Evenings in her tiny room above the shop, reading by lamplight or mending her clothes. And twice a week, when weather permitted, she rode up into the mountains to help Rhett with the cattle. The arrangement raised eyebrows throughout town, but Harriet stopped caring somewhere around the third or fourth pointed comment from Mrs. Crawford. Let them talk. She was learning things that mattered: how to read weather patterns in the color of the sky, how to track animal movements through snow, how to survive in country that killed the unprepared without hesitation. More than that, she was learning who she could be when nobody was watching. You're favoring your left side, Rhett said one afternoon as they guided a small group of cattle through a narrow canyon pass. Sit deeper in the saddle. Let the horse do the work. Harriet adjusted her position, feeling the immediate difference in balance. Better? Better. He rode alongside her, eyes scanning the canyon walls. You're getting good at this. Don't sound so surprised. Not surprised, just observant. He pointed ahead where the canyon opened into a wider valley. We'll winter the herd down there. Protected from the worst winds, good grazing if we clear the snow. They worked until sunset, painting the snow gold and pink, then made camp in a sheltered spot beneath an overhang. Rhett built a fire with the same efficient movements he did everything. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Harriet had learned to match his pace, to anticipate what needed doing next. You planning to stay in Black Hollow? Rhett asked as they ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack. Or is this just temporary until you figure out where you really want to be? Harriet considered the question. A month ago, she wouldn't have had an answer. Now, I don't know yet, she admitted. Chicago was never home, even before the fire. My aunt's house definitely wasn't, but I'm not sure anywhere's felt like home. Home's not a place, Rhett said quietly. It's a feeling, safety, belonging, knowing you can be yourself without apologizing for it. Have you ever had that? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Once. Long time ago. Harriet waited, sensing there was more if she didn't push. Had a wife, Rhett said finally. Sarah. Met her in Wyoming before I came here. She was a rancher's daughter, knew the land better than most men. Taught me half of what I know about cattle. His voice went soft. Married her the same year I bought the mountain property, built the cabin together, planned to build a real ranch, have kids. The whole future. What happened? Fever took her the second winter. The words came out flat, controlled. 1 week she was fine, the next she was gone. Nothing I could do. Doctor was 3 days away, and by the time I got him there, he stopped. Been 7 years. Still feels like yesterday sometimes. Harriet's chest ached. I'm sorry. Why? You didn't cause it. Because it's a terrible thing to lose someone you love. Rhett looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. You lost both your parents. That's worse. Pain's not a competition. No, he agreed. It's not. They sat in silence, watching the fire crackle. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound no longer frightened Harriet the way it had that first night in the blizzard. Now it was just part of the mountain's voice. Is that why you stay up here? Harriet asked. Because she's buried somewhere nearby? Partly. Rhett added another stick to the fire. But mostly because I learned something after she died. People down in the valleys and the towns, they need you to fit in a box they understand. Good or bad, hero or villain, respectable or dangerous. They can't handle anything more complicated than that. He met her eyes. Up here, I don't have to be anything except what I am. The mountains don't judge. Harriet understood that better than he probably realized. The town thinks I'm wasting my time learning from you, she said. They think I should be focused on finding a husband, or at least making myself useful in more feminine ways. What do you think? I think I've spent 24 years letting other people tell me what I should be doing with my life. I'm done with that. Rhett nodded slowly. Good. They rode back to Black Hollow the next morning, parting ways at the town's edge as always. Rhett never came further than necessary, and Harriet had stopped asking him to. She understood now that his absence from town wasn't fear. It was choice. He'd built a life that didn't require their approval, and he protected that life fiercely. But as Harriet walked through Black Hollow's main street, she noticed something different in the way people looked at her. Not pity anymore, something harder, colder. She found out why when she reached the general store. Sykes was waiting on the porch, his expression grim. We need to talk. Harriet followed him inside. He closed the door, pulled the shade, and turned to face her. I like you, Miss Calloway. You're a hard worker, honest, reliable, but I can't keep you on anymore." The words hit like a physical blow. What? Why? Because half my customers have threatened to take their business elsewhere if I keep employing the woman who's been spending her time with Rhett Maddox. Sykes looked genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry. I truly am. But I can't afford to lose that much business. I got a family to feed. I work hard. You said so yourself." "You do. But it doesn't matter." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "Here's 2 weeks' wages. You can stay in the room for another week. Give you time to figure something out." Harriet took the envelope with numb fingers. Who complained? Was it Mrs. Crawford? Wasn't just one person. Was a group of them. Crawford, the minister's wife, Emily Sutton and her mother, couple others. They came in together yesterday, said it was inappropriate for a business to employ someone who was openly associating with a known murderer. Said it set a bad example for the young women in town. "He's not a murderer." "Maybe not, but they believe he is, and their money spends just as well as yours." Sykes sighed. "Look, you seem like a decent girl. You want my advice? Leave Black Hollow. Go somewhere you can start fresh without all this history hanging over you. Montana's got plenty of other towns." Harriet walked upstairs to her tiny room and sat on the bed, staring at the envelope in her hands. Run. That's what Sykes had said. What everyone always said when life got difficult. Just run somewhere else, start over, pretend the problems don't exist. She'd run from Chicago, run from her aunt's house, run from every place that made her feel small and unwanted. And where had it gotten her? Right back to the same situation. Rejected, dismissed, told she was wrong for being herself. No more. Harriet stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the boarding house. She marched straight to the sheriff's office and pushed open the door. Sheriff Boone Keller looked up from his desk, eyebrows rising. He was a big man, late 40s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in bad weather. "Help you?" "I want to report harassment," Harriet said. Keller leaned back in his chair. "That's so. Who's harassing you?" "Mrs. Crawford, Emily Sutton, and several other women who organized a campaign to get me fired from my job because they don't approve of who I spend my time with." Something flickered across Keller's face. Amusement, maybe. "That's not harassment, miss. That's just people exercising their right to do business with who they choose. It's coordinated intimidation designed to force me out of town. It's free association." Keller folded his hands on the desk. "Look, I understand you're upset about losing your position, but what those women did isn't illegal. They didn't threaten you, didn't harm you physically. They just made their preferences known to a business owner, and he made his decision. So there's nothing you can do, nothing I can do, and nothing I would do even if I could." Keller's expression hardened. "You want some advice, Miss Calloway? Stop spending time with Rhett Maddox. Man's dangerous. He might have gotten away with killing Donovan, but everyone knows he did it. You keep associating with him, you're going to end up hurt, if not by him, then by the consequences of defending him. He didn't kill anyone. You know that for certain, do you? You were there?" "I know him." Keller laughed, sharp and mean. "You've known him for what, a few weeks? Worked cattle with him a couple times? That doesn't mean you know anything about what he's capable of." He stood, walked around the desk. "I'm going to be real clear with you. Rhett Maddox is a problem this town has tolerated too long. He lives up in those mountains like he's better than everyone else, only comes down when he needs supplies, acts like the law doesn't apply to him. And now he's got some naive girl from Chicago following him around like a lost puppy." Harriet's hands clenched. "I'm not following him anywhere. I'm learning skills that might actually keep me alive out here, which is more than anyone else in this town has offered to teach me." "That's your choice, but choices have consequences." Keller opened the door. "You're dismissed." Harriet walked out, shaking with anger. She made it halfway down the street before Emily Sutton and 2 other young women stepped directly into her path. "Well, well," Emily said, her pretty face arranged in an expression of false concern. "I heard you lost your position at the store. What a shame." Harriet tried to step around them, but they moved to block her. "I suppose you'll be leaving Black Hollow now," one of the other women said. "Without employment, you can't afford to stay." "Unless you're planning to move into that cabin with your mountain man," Emily added. "I'm sure he'd love that. A woman who's so desperate she'll settle for a murderer nobody else wants." "Move," Harriet said quietly. "Or what?" Emily stepped closer. You'll do what exactly? You're nothing. You have no job, no money, no friends, no prospects. You're just some fat girl who thought she could come west and reinvent herself, but guess what? You're the same pathetic person here that you were in Chicago. Something inside Harriet snapped. She didn't hit Emily. She wanted to, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped forward, using her size and weight for the first time in her life, not as something to apologize for, but as an advantage, forcing Emily to stumble backward or be run over. You're right about one thing, Harriet said, her voice steady and cold. I did come here to reinvent myself, but not because I was pathetic in Chicago, because people like you made me believe I was, made me think being different meant being wrong, made me apologize for existing. She looked at each of them in turn. I'm done apologizing, and I'm not going anywhere. She walked past them, shoulders back, ignoring the shocked silence behind her. But as she turned the corner, she heard Emily's voice rise. We'll see about that. That night, Harriet lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. 2 weeks until her room rental ran out, no job, no prospects, and now she'd made enemies of some of the most influential women in Black Hollow. Smart, Harriet, real smart. But she didn't regret it. For the first time in her life, she'd stood up for herself without backing down. That had to count for something. The question was what to do next. She could leave, like Sykes suggested, find another frontier town, try again somewhere else. But running felt like admitting defeat, like proving Emily and all the others right, that Harriet Calloway didn't belong anywhere. Or she could stay, find another way to survive, prove she was tougher than they thought. The problem was she had no idea how. Morning came too fast. Harriet dressed and went downstairs, planning to walk to the outskirts of town where she could think without running into people who wanted her gone. Instead, she found Rhett waiting outside the boarding house. He sat on his horse, relaxed and patient, like he'd been there for hours. When he saw her, he touched his hat brim. Heard you lost your job, he said. Word traveled fast in small towns. News travels. Was it because of me? Harriet considered lying, then decided against it. Partly. Mostly it's because this town has decided what I am and doesn't like the answer. Rhett nodded slowly. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to cost you your livelihood. It's not your fault people are small-minded. Maybe not. But I can help fix it. He shifted in his saddle. I've been thinking about expanding the ranch, running more cattle, building up the operation. I could use someone permanent to help manage it. Someone who knows the work, can handle the mountains, isn't afraid of long hours and hard conditions. Harriet's heart jumped. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership. You work the ranch with me, we split the profits 60-40. You get 40% until you've learned enough to make it 50-50. He met her eyes. It'll be hard work. Harder than the store, and it means living up on the mountain most of the year, only coming to town for supplies. But you'd have a place to live, work that matters, and nobody telling you what you can or can't do. It was everything Harriet wanted and nothing she'd expected. Why? She asked. Why would you offer this to me? Because you're good at the work. Because you've earned it. And because... He paused, choosing words carefully. Because I've been alone up there for 7 years, and I'm tired of it. Not looking for anything romantic, he added quickly. Just tired of silence, tired of having nobody to talk to except cattle and wolves. You made that cabin feel less empty, even just for one night. Figured maybe if you were around more, it might feel like a home again instead of just a place to sleep. Harriet's throat tightened. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. What would people say? She asked. An unmarried woman living on your ranch? Let them say whatever they want. We'll know the truth, and that's what matters. Rhett extended his hand. What do you say, partner? Harriet looked at his hand, looked at the mountains beyond the town, looked at the life being offered, difficult, isolated, completely different from anything she'd imagined. And she took his hand. Partners, she said. Over the next week, Harriet packed her few belongings and prepared to leave Black Hollow behind. Mrs. Crawford made her disapproval abundantly clear, refusing to speak to Harriet except to demand payment for the room. Emily Sutton spread rumors that Harriet was moving in with Rhett as his mistress. The minister's wife stopped Harriet on the street to warn her about the dangers of living in sin. Harriet listened to all of it with a polite smile and said nothing. Let them think what they wanted. She knew the truth. On her last day in town, Sykes stopped her outside the general store. I heard about Maddox's offer, he said. You really going through with it? I am. He studied her face for a long moment. You know, my sister lived in a mining town in Colorado before she got married. She told me once that the frontier doesn't care if you're a man or a woman, big or small, pretty or plain. It only cares if you can survive, if you've got the spine for it. He smiled slightly. I think you've got the spine for it, Miss Calloway. Good luck out there. It was the kindest thing anyone in Black Hollow had said to her in weeks. Thank you, Mr. Sykes. Rhett met her at dawn the next morning with a pack horse for her belongings. They rode out of Black Hollow as the town was waking up, and Harriet didn't look back once. The cabin looked different in morning light, smaller than she remembered, but somehow more welcoming. Rhett had already built a second sleeping area in the loft, giving them both privacy. He'd also stocked extra supplies, built new shelves, and cleared space for her things. This is your home now, too, he said as they unloaded the horses. You can change whatever you want, arrange things however makes sense to you. Just because I've lived alone doesn't mean you have to live by my rules. They fell into a routine quickly. Morning started before dawn, feeding the horses, checking the cattle, hauling water from the creek. Afternoons were for maintenance work, repairing fences, chopping wood, treating sick animals. Evenings they spent planning the next day's tasks or working on larger projects like building a proper barn. The work was brutal. Harriet's muscles screamed for the first 2 weeks. She developed calluses on her hands, bruises on her legs from where cattle kicked her, a permanent ache in her lower back from hauling feed. But she loved it. Loved waking up to mountain air so clean it hurt to breathe. Loved the satisfaction of fixing a fence line or successfully treating a sick calf. Loved the way her body grew stronger, more capable, less something to apologize for, and more something to rely on. And she loved the easy companionship that developed between her and Rhett. They worked well together, him with his years of experience, her with her quick mind and determination to learn. He taught her to shoot, to track, to read the subtle signs that meant a storm was coming or predators were near. She taught him about bookkeeping, showed him ways to organize the supply inventory, suggested improvements to the cabin's layout. They talked about everything and nothing, their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Rhett told her about growing up in Texas, learning to ranch from his father, watching his family lose everything to drought and debt. Harriet told him about her parents, her mother's kindness, her father's quiet strength, how the fire had started in the middle of the night and spread so fast there was no time to save anything. You ever think about what your life would have been like if they'd survived? Rhett asked one evening as they sat outside watching sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. All the time, Harriet admitted. I think my father would have supported me coming west. He always said women were tougher than men gave them credit for. My mother would have worried, but she would have understood. She smiled sadly. They would have liked you, I think. My father especially. He appreciated people who did honest work and didn't pretend to be something they weren't. I would have liked to meet them. It was a simple statement, but it meant everything. Winter deepened. Snow fell heavy and constant, burying the mountain in white. They spent days snowed in, maintaining the cabin and caring for the horses. Harriet learned to cook over the fireplace, to sew torn clothing, to make soap from ash and fat. Skills that would have seemed beneath her in Chicago now felt essential, important. One morning in late January, Rhett woke her before dawn. Need to check the cattle, he said quietly. Storm coming in fast. If we don't move the herd to lower ground now, we'll lose half of them. They rode out in darkness, the wind already picking up. By the time they reached the herd, snow was falling in thick curtains. The cattle were restless, sensing the coming storm. We need to move them through the canyon pass, Rhett shouted over the wind. It's risky in this weather, but it's the only way to get them to shelter before the worst hits. They worked in tandem, pushing the herd toward the narrow canyon entrance. The cattle resisted, frightened by the storm, but Harriet had learned how to read their movements, how to position her horse to guide rather than force. Halfway through the pass, disaster struck. A massive gust of wind roared through the canyon, spooking the lead cattle. They surged forward, panicking the rest of the herd. Suddenly, 24 frightened animals were stampeding through a space barely wide enough for them to pass single file. Get clear, Rhett yelled. Harriet tried to steer her horse to the canyon wall, but the mare lost her footing on the icy ground. They went down hard, Harriet rolling clear just as hooves thundered past inches from her head. She scrambled to her feet, pressed herself against the rock face as the herd stampeded past. When the last animal passed, she looked for Rhett. He was further up the canyon, still mounted, trying to turn the herd before they ran themselves off a cliff at the far end. But his horse was limping badly, injured in the chaos. Harriet's mare had bolted. She was on foot half a mile from the cabin in a blizzard that was getting worse by the minute. She started running. Her boots slipped on ice. Wind tore at her coat, snow blinded her, but she kept moving, following the canyon wall, knowing Rhett would need help stopping the herd. She found him at the canyon's end, his horse down completely now, while he stood in front of the stampeding cattle waving his coat and firing his pistol in the air. It was working, barely. The led cattle were slowing, turning back. Harriet grabbed a fallen branch and joined him, shouting and waving, creating a barrier the frightened animals refused to cross. Slowly, painfully, the stampede halted. The cattle milled in confusion, then began to calm as the initial panic faded. Rhett lowered his pistol, breathing hard. "You all right?" "Fine. Your horse?" "Broken leg." He said it matter of fact, but Harriet saw the pain in his eyes. That horse had carried him for 5 years. "I'll have to put him down." "I'm sorry. Part of ranching." He holstered the pistol, looked at the herd. "We need to get them moved before the storm gets worse. You think you can handle pushing them from behind while I lead on foot?" "Yes." They worked for 3 more hours in brutal conditions, finally getting the herd down to the protected valley Rhett had shown her weeks earlier. By the time they finished, both were exhausted, frozen, barely able to stand. The walk back to the cabin took another hour. Rhett had put his horse down before they left. One quick shot, then silence, and Harriet could see how much it cost him even though he didn't say a word. When they finally stumbled into the cabin, they moved on autopilot. Fire, dry clothes, hot food. They didn't speak, just went through the motions of survival. Harriet collapsed into the chair by the fire, her hands shaking as reaction set in. They'd almost died out there. One wrong move, one bad decision, and the canyon would have become their grave. "You did good today," Rhett said quietly from where he sat against the wall. "Better than good, you saved half the herd by helping turn them." "We saved them together." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Sarah would have liked you." Harriet looked at him, surprised. He never talked about his late wife. "She was fearless, too," Rhett continued, staring into the fire. "Not reckless, just absolutely unafraid of hard work or danger if it meant protecting what mattered. You remind me of her in that way." "That's quite a compliment." "It's the truth." He met her eyes. "I thought I wanted to be alone up here. Thought that was easier than trusting anyone again. But having you here, it's been good, really good. Like remembering what it feels like to have a partner instead of just surviving on my own." Warmth spread through Harriet's chest. "I feel the same way. For the first time since my parents died, I feel like I'm building something instead of just running from things." They sat in comfortable silence as the storm raged outside, and Harriet realized something fundamental had shifted between them. They weren't just working together anymore. They were building something real, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared hardship, and genuine trust. It felt like home. But as February arrived and the worst of winter began to break, trouble found them anyway. It started with small things, fence lines cut, gates left open so cattle wandered, supplies that went missing from the shed. "Could be drifters," Rhett said, examining the cut fence. "Mountain's got plenty of people passing through." But Harriet saw the worry in his eyes. This felt deliberate, targeted. 2 weeks later, they rode into Black Hollow for supplies and found the town transformed. Where before it had been quiet and half empty, now it buzzed with activity. New buildings going up. Well-dressed men Harriet didn't recognize talking on street corners. An air of money and ambition that hadn't existed before. "What's happening?" Harriet asked Sykes as he filled their supply order. "Big changes coming," Sykes said, his expression troubled. Cattle baron named Marcus Thornton bought the Donovan Ranch, the whole spread, everything. He's bringing in investors from back east, planning to consolidate all the small ranches into one massive operation. Already bought out Peterson, the Johnsons, and half a dozen others. They're calling it the Montana Cattle Empire. Rhett's jaw tightened. "And the ranchers who won't sell?" "Well," Sykes glanced around, lowered his voice. "Word is Thornton doesn't take no for an answer. Those fence problems you've been having, you're not the only one. Every rancher who's refused his offer has had similar troubles: accidents, losses, pressure. That's not legal. No, it's not. But Sheriff Keller seems real interested in looking the other way, especially since Thornton's been making generous donations to the town's development fund. Sykes handed over their supplies. You two be careful out there. Thornton's got men who aren't afraid to get rough. They rode back to the cabin in tense silence. As they crested the ridge overlooking their valley, Rhett pulled his horse to a stop. This is going to get worse before it gets better, he said quietly. Thornton won't stop until he owns this whole valley, and I'm not selling. Then we fight, Harriet said. We? He looked at her. This is my problem, not yours. Your partnership agreement was for ranching, not war. The partnership was for whatever it takes to keep this place running. If that means fighting off land grabbers, then that's what we do. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not running, Rhett. Not from this, not from anything. We're in this together. Something fierce and grateful flashed across his face. Together, then. But neither of them knew just how brutal the coming war would be, or how high the price of staying would climb. The attacks escalated quickly. More fences cut. A shed burned in the night. Poisoned water troughs that killed 3 cattle before they caught it. Rhett responded by setting traps and keeping watch through the nights. Harriet learned to shoot better, to sleep light, to wake at the slightest sound. They were preparing for siege without calling it that. One morning in early March, Harriet woke to find Rhett already dressed, his rifle in hand, staring out the window. What is it? She asked. Company? He nodded toward the valley below. Harriet joined him at the window and saw 4 riders approaching the cabin. Even from a distance, she could tell they weren't friendly visitors. Stay inside, Rhett said. Let me handle this. Not a chance. He looked like he wanted to argue, then just sighed. At least stay behind me. They walked out together. The 4 riders pulled up 20 feet from the cabin. 3 were rough-looking men in working clothes, guns visible at their hips. The 4th was better dressed, expensive coat, polished boots, a face that belonged in a banker's office rather than on horseback. Rhett Maddox, the well-dressed man said pleasantly. I'm Thomas Webb, representing Mr. Marcus Thornton's interests. I believe you received our previous offers to purchase this property? I did, Rhett said flatly, and I declined. Yes, well, Mr. Thornton sent me to extend one final offer, a very generous one. Webb pulled a document from his coat. $15,000 for the land, buildings, and all cattle. That's 3 times what this property's worth. Not interested. Mr. Maddox, I urge you to reconsider. Mr. Thornton is building something unprecedented in Montana, a cattle operation that will supply beef to the entire Western Territory. This valley is essential to his plans. He will acquire it, one way or another. The question is whether you'll be compensated fairly or, Webb's pleasant expression hardened slightly, or whether circumstances will force a less agreeable resolution. That a threat? That's reality. Webb's eyes shifted to Harriet. And I'd hate to see anyone get hurt because of stubbornness, especially a lady. Rhett's hand moved toward his gun. Easy, Webb said, and his 3 companions tensed. No need for violence. Not today. I'm simply delivering Mr. Thornton's final offer. You have 1 week to consider. After that, he shrugged. Well, accidents happen in the mountains. Would be a shame if something happened to this nice cabin, or those cattle, or, his eyes lingered on Harriet, or the people living here. Get off my land, Rhett said quietly. Webb smiled. 1 week, Mr. Maddox. Choose wisely. They rode off, and Harriet felt ice in her stomach. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal, dangerous. We should go to the sheriff, she said. Keller's bought. You heard Sykes. Rhett watched the riders disappear. We're on our own. Then we prepare. And they did. Over the next week, they turned the cabin and ranch into a fortress, reinforced the doors and windows, stocked ammunition, moved the most valuable supplies inside, brought the horses closer, prepared for the worst. On the 7th day, nothing happened. On the 8th day, they woke to smoke. The barn was burning. Not the makeshift one near the cabin, but the larger structure they'd built in the lower valley where they'd moved most of the herd for spring grazing. The cattle! Harriet gasped. They ran for the horses, but by the time they reached the valley, it was too late. The barn was fully engulfed. The panicked cattle had scattered, and in the chaos, Harriet saw men on horseback, driving the herd away, stealing them in broad daylight. "Bastards!" Rhett snarled. He raised his rifle. "Don't!" Harriet said, grabbing his arm. "There's too many. They'll kill us both." He knew she was right, but she could see how much it cost him to lower the weapon and watch his cattle disappear. When the rustlers were gone, they walked through the burned remains of the barn. Everything was destroyed. Months of work, thousands of dollars in losses. "This is just the beginning," Rhett said quietly. "Thornton's sending a message. Sell, or he'll destroy everything I've built." "So what do we do?" Rhett looked at her, and she saw something dangerous kindle in his eyes. "We make him regret threatening us." Making Marcus Thornton regret his threats turned out to be harder than Harriet expected, mostly because the man was a ghost. He never showed his face, never got his own hands dirty. Everything came through intermediaries, Webb and his crew of hired guns who rode the valley like they owned it, making sure every small rancher knew the price of resistance. The remaining cattle Rhett managed to salvage from the barn fire numbered barely a dozen head. Everything else was gone, stolen, scattered, or dead. It was a crippling loss, one that would take years to recover from under normal circumstances. But circumstances weren't normal anymore. "We can't just sit here and wait for the next attack," Harriet said 3 days after the fire. They were in the cabin, going over what little supplies remained. "They'll keep hitting us until there's nothing left to defend." Rhett sat at the table, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "What do you suggest? Ride into town and challenge Thornton to a duel? This isn't the Old West anymore, Harriet. Men like him use lawyers and money and hired muscle. They don't fight fair." "Then we don't fight fair either." He looked up at her, something sharp in his gray eyes. "Explain." Harriet had been thinking about this for days, turning it over in her mind during the sleepless nights when every sound outside made her reach for the rifle. "Thornton wants this valley because of the water access and the grazing land, but he needs all of it, not just pieces. If even one ranch holds out, it ruins his plans for the Montana Cattle Empire or whatever he's calling it." "I'm aware. That's why he's targeting me." "Right. But you're not the only small rancher left. There's still the Hendersons to the east, the McClellans to the south, and at least 3 others I've heard about in town. If we could organize them, band together—" "They won't help." Rhett's voice was flat. "Most of those families think I killed Donovan. They're more likely to side with Thornton than with me." "Maybe, but they're also facing the same pressure we are. Thornton's not just after your land, he's after everyone's. And people who are scared will do surprising things if you give them a reason to hope instead of hide." Rhett studied her face for a long moment. "You want to organize a resistance. Unite the small ranchers against Thornton's consolidation. I want to survive, and we can't do that alone." He was quiet, turning it over. Then finally, reluctantly, he nodded. "All right, we try it your way. But if they turn us away, which they will, we come back here and we prepare to defend what's ours by ourselves. Agreed?" "Agreed." They rode out the next morning, heading first to the Henderson Ranch because it was closest and because Mary Henderson had always struck Harriet as practical rather than prejudiced during their few interactions in town. The Henderson place was modest, a weathered house, a small barn, chickens scratching in the yard. When they rode up, John Henderson came out with a shotgun, his face hard. "Maddox, Miss Calloway, state your business and move on." "We need to talk," Rhett said, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "About Thornton." "Nothing to talk about. We're selling. Thornton made us a fair offer, and we're taking it." Harriet saw Mary Henderson appear in the doorway behind her husband, a baby on her hip and worry etched deep in her face. "Fair?" Harriet said. "Is that before or after he burned our barn and stole our cattle?" John's expression flickered. "That was you? We heard about trouble up in the mountain valley, but, It was us," Rhett said quietly, "and we're not the only ones. Ask around. Every rancher who's refused Thornton's offers has had accidents, fences cut, animals poisoned, buildings burned. This isn't business, Henderson. It's extortion." "Maybe so, but we got 3 kids and another on the way." John lowered the shotgun slightly. "I can't risk my family for a piece of land. Thornton's money will let us start over somewhere safe." "Nowhere safe if men like Thornton learn they can take whatever they want through violence," Harriet said. "Today it's ranches in Montana. Tomorrow it's something else. Somewhere else. Running doesn't solve the problem. Mary stepped forward, shifting the baby to her other hip. You're asking us to fight. Against hired guns and men with more money than we'll see in 3 lifetimes. That's not practical, Miss Calloway. That's suicide. Maybe, Harriet admitted, but if we band together all the small ranchers who are left, we'd have numbers. Strength. Witnesses if anything happens. Thornton can pick us off one by one, but if we stand together, it gets a lot harder for him to operate in the shadows. John and Mary exchanged a long look, one of those wordless conversations that only married couples could have. Even if we wanted to help, John said slowly, which I'm not saying we do, why would we trust you, Maddox? Half the valley thinks you murdered Donovan. I didn't kill him, Rhett said, but I understand why people think I did, and I understand why that makes me a hard man to trust. So I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust your own eyes. Look at what Thornton's doing. Look at who's getting hurt, and ask yourself if selling to him makes you safe or just makes you complicit. The words hung in the cold morning air. Finally, Mary spoke. The McClellans are still holding out. So are the Porters. If you could get them on board, maybe we'd consider it. But we're not going to be the only ones standing against Thornton. That's just asking to get picked off first. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Fair enough, Harriet said. We'll talk to the others. They rode to the McClellan Ranch next, then the Porter place, then 2 more small holdings that Rhett knew about. The story was the same everywhere. Fear, suspicion, and the bone-deep exhaustion of people who'd been fighting just to survive for too long already. But something else emerged too. Anger. Every single rancher they spoke to had a story about Thornton's men. Threats delivered in the dark. Stock gone missing. Pressure applied through Sheriff Keller to pay taxes early or face liens. A pattern of organized intimidation that went far beyond normal business competition. By the end of the day, they'd found 4 ranchers willing to at least attend a meeting to discuss options. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Where do we hold it? Harriet asked as they rode back toward the cabin. Can't be anyone's ranch, too risky. If Thornton's men found out, they could attack while everyone's gathered. There's an old hunting lodge about 10 miles north, Rhett said. Been abandoned for years, but the structure's still sound. Neutral ground. Easy to defend if we need to. When should we do it? Soon, before Thornton makes his next move. They set the meeting for 3 days out, spreading word quietly through the few people they trusted. On the appointed evening, Harriet and Rhett rode to the old lodge early to prepare. The building was exactly as Rhett had described, abandoned but solid, tucked into a narrow valley with good sight lines. They built a fire in the stone hearth and waited. John and Mary Henderson arrived first, leaving their children with Mary's sister in town. Then came the McClellans, an older couple who'd been ranching this valley for 30 years. The Porters showed up with their adult son, all 3 of them armed and wary. 2 more families Harriet didn't know well rounded out the group. 8 ranching families in total, representing maybe 15 adults and twice that many dependents. Not an army, barely even a resistance. But it was something. Rhett stood near the fire, uncomfortable with all the eyes on him. Harriet could see him struggling with what to say, how to convince people who'd spent years believing he was dangerous. She stood up instead. Thank you all for coming, she said. I know this wasn't an easy decision. I know most of you don't trust Rhett, and some of you probably don't trust me either. But we're all here because we're facing the same problem. Marcus Thornton wants this valley, and he's willing to destroy anyone who won't sell to get it. We know what Thornton is, Jacob McClellan said, his weathered face grim. Question is what we can do about it. Man's got money, lawyers, hired guns, and the sheriff in his pocket. What do we have? A few ranches and a lot of stubbornness. We have knowledge of this land, Rhett said quietly. We have witnesses to Thornton's crimes, and we have each other if we choose to stand together. Pretty words, Porter's son said. But what's the actual plan? We band together and wait for Thornton to burn us all out instead of one at a time. No, Harriet said. We document everything. Every threat, every attack, every piece of evidence that Thornton's using illegal methods to force sales. We gather it all, and we take it to the territorial marshal in Helena. Go over Keller's head directly to federal law enforcement. That'll take weeks, Mary Henderson said. Maybe months. What do we do in the meantime while Thornton's men are hitting our ranches? We watch each other's backs, Rhett said. We set up a rotation, at least 2 families always keeping watch on the other's property. If Thornton's men hit one ranch, we all respond. They can't fight all of us at once, and they can't operate in secret if we're documenting everything they do. And if the marshal doesn't care, John Henderson asked, if he's as bought as Keller? Then we go to the newspapers, Harriet said. Make this public. Thornton's building his reputation on being a legitimate businessman creating an empire. If the truth about his methods gets out, it'll destroy that reputation. Bad publicity is sometimes the only thing rich men fear. The families talked among themselves, debating, arguing. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to take Thornton's money and run. Fear and hope warred on every face. Finally, Jacob McClellan spoke up. I've been ranching this valley since before most of you were born. I've survived drought, disease, hard winters, and harder markets. I'll be damned if I let some Eastern money man drive me off my land through threats and violence. He looked around at the others. I'm in. Whatever we're doing, count me in. One by one, the others agreed. Not everyone. 2 families decided to take their chances with Thornton's offer. But 6 families committed to standing together, to documenting the crimes, to fighting back the only way they could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. Over the next 2 weeks, the small coalition put their plan into action. They organized watch rotations, with armed men riding between properties to check for trouble. They started keeping detailed logs of every suspicious incident. Harriet took charge of that, her neat handwriting filling page after page with dates, times, descriptions, witnesses. And they waited for Thornton's response. It came on a Tuesday morning when Harriet was alone at the cabin while Rhett checked the eastern fence line. She heard riders approaching and grabbed the rifle Rhett had taught her to use. 5 men this time, led by Thomas Webb. But these weren't the same hired hands from before. These men looked harder, meaner, like they'd done more than deliver threats. Harriet stepped out onto the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. Miss Calloway, Webb said, his pleasant mask firmly in place. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Maddox. He's not here. Pity. Webb's eyes traveled over the cabin, the outbuildings, lingering on details like he was cataloging them. I wanted to inform him personally that Mr. Thornton's patience has expired. The offer to purchase is withdrawn. As of today, this property is considered in violation of territorial water rights regulations, and Mr. Thornton has filed a claim with the land office to seize it through legal channels. Harriet's stomach dropped. You can't do that. Rhett has legal title to this land. Legal title, yes, but water rights are a separate matter, Miss Calloway. And according to territorial law, water rights can be challenged if a party can prove superior claim based on commercial necessity. Mr. Thornton's operation requires access to the creek that runs through this property. Your small ranching operation does not constitute sufficient commercial use to maintain exclusive rights. It was legal theft, dressed up in paperwork and regulations. We'll fight it, Harriet said. Of course you will. And you'll lose. But please, take your time. The courts move slowly. Webb smiled. In the meantime, I'd be very careful if I were you. These mountains can be dangerous. Accidents happen. Would hate to see anything befall you or Mr. Maddox while you're waiting for your legal appeal to fail. The other men chuckled, a sound that raised the hair on the back of Harriet's neck. Leave, she said, raising the rifle to her shoulder. Now. Webb's smile never wavered. Of course. But do give Mr. Maddox my regards. Tell him Mr. Thornton looks forward to acquiring his property, one way or another. They rode off, and Harriet stood on the porch, shaking with rage and fear, until Rhett returned an hour later. She told him everything. Rhett listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. It's smart, he finally said. Can't prove the water rights claim is fraudulent, even though we know it is. Can't fight it in court without lawyers we can't afford. By the time it gets resolved, Thornton will have found another angle to attack from. So what do we do? Rhett looked at her, and she saw something dangerous in his eyes, the same look he'd had when they found the barn burning. We stopped playing by their rules. That night, they rode to the old lodge and called an emergency meeting. Only 4 families showed up. The Hendersons, McClellans, Porters, and one other. The rest had already sold out or were too afraid to keep fighting. Rhett laid out the situation bluntly. Thornton shifted tactics. He's going to take our land through legal theft. Water rights claims, tax liens, regulatory violations. Things we can't fight in court without money and time we don't have. So we need to change the game.
How? Porter asked.
We make this public before he can lock it down legally. We ride to Helena, talk to the newspapers, force the territorial government to investigate, create enough noise that Thornton can't operate quietly anymore. That'll take at least one of us away from our ranches for weeks, John Henderson said. And who's going to believe a handful of small ranchers over a man with Thornton's resources?
I'll go, Harriet said.
Everyone turned to look at her. I can make the ride to Helena. I've been keeping the documentation. I know every detail of every attack, every threat, every illegal action. And I'm not from here, which means I don't have the same history weighing me down. People might actually listen. It's a 4-day ride to Helena, Rhett said, in dangerous country. And if Thornton finds out you're going, then you'll have to make sure he doesn't find out until I'm already gone. Rhett started to argue, then stopped himself. She could see him running through the options, the possibilities, and coming to the same conclusion she had. Someone had to go. And she was the logical choice. I don't like it, he said quietly. You don't have to like it. You just have to trust me to do it. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement of how far they'd come, how much they'd built together, how much they stood to lose.
All right, Rhett said.
But we do this smart. You leave tomorrow before dawn, take the north route through the timber where Thornton's men are less likely to patrol. I'll spread word that you've gone east to visit family, throw them off your trail. The rest of us will keep up the watch rotations, make everything look normal. And if something happens while I'm gone, Harriet asked.
We handle it. Rhett's voice was steel.
You get to Helena, you tell our story, and you get help. That's your job. Our job is to make sure there's still something left when you get back. Harriet spent that night preparing. She packed light, clothes, food, water, the documentation carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from weather. Rhett gave her his best horse, a steady gelding named Ghost, who could cover ground quickly and had the endurance for a long ride. You know how to shoot if you need to, Rhett said as they loaded her saddlebags in the pre-dawn darkness. But avoid conflict if you can. Getting to Helena matters more than winning any fight along the way. I know. And if you run into trouble you can't handle, you find the nearest ranch or town and you get help. Don't try to be a hero. Rhett, Harriet put her hand on his arm. I know what I'm doing. He looked at her in the dim light from the cabin's open door, and she saw fear in his eyes, real, raw fear. Not for himself, but for her. I can't lose you, he said quietly. Not like... He stopped, swallowed hard. Just be careful. I will. She squeezed his arm. Keep yourself alive while I'm gone. That's an order, partner. That got a ghost of a smile. Yes, ma'am. She mounted Ghost, settled into the saddle, and looked down at Rhett one more time. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Maybe less if I can push hard. I'll be here. Harriet turned the horse north and rode into the darkness, not looking back. The first 2 days were uneventful. She followed game trails through heavy timber, avoiding main roads where Thornton's men might be watching. The country was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, vast, empty, indifferent to human struggles. She passed abandoned homesteads, evidence of others who'd tried to tame this land and failed. On the 3rd day, trouble found her. She was watering Ghost at a creek when she heard horses. Multiple riders, moving fast. Harriet grabbed her rifle and took cover behind a fallen log, watching through the trees. 3 men rode into view, and even at a distance, she recognized the hard look of Thornton's hired guns. They were tracking something. Maybe her, maybe someone else. Either way, she couldn't let them see her. She waited, barely breathing, as they circled the area. One of them dismounted, studied the ground near the creek where Ghost had left tracks. Someone came through here recent, the man called to his companions, heading north. Could be anyone, another replied. Trappers use these trails. Could be. Or could be that Calloway woman. Webb said to watch for her, said Maddox might send her running for help. Harriet's heart hammered. They knew. Somehow Thornton had guessed what they'd do. Spread out, the first man ordered. If she's ahead of us, we'll catch her before nightfall. They rode on, but now they were actively hunting. Harriet waited until they were out of sight, then quickly led Ghost deeper into the timber, away from the trail. She'd have to take a longer route now, stay off the obvious paths. But longer meant more time. And more time meant more danger for Rhett and the others back home. She pushed on through rough country, climbing higher into the mountains where the snow still lay thick, and the going was treacherous. Ghost handled it well, sure-footed and steady, but every hour felt like a race against a clock she couldn't see. On the fourth night, she made camp in a shallow cave, not daring to light a fire even though the temperature was dropping fast. She ate cold food and tried to sleep, but every sound jerked her awake. Wind in the trees, animals moving in the dark, the constant paranoia that Thornton's men were closing in. The fifth day brought her within sight of Helena. The territorial capital sprawled in a valley below, larger than Black Hollow, more civilized, with actual streets and buildings that looked permanent. Salvation, if she could reach it. She rode into town at midday, exhausted and filthy, and went straight to the territorial marshal's office. Marshal Edwin Crawford was a lean man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much to be easily impressed. He listened to Harriet's story with no expression, occasionally glancing at the documentation she spread across his desk. When she finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "Miss Calloway, these are serious allegations. Arson, theft, extortion, illegal land seizure. If even half of what you're saying is true, Marcus Thornton has committed multiple felonies." "It's all true," Harriet said. "Every word. And it's all documented. Dates, times, witnesses." "I don't doubt your sincerity, but understanding you'll need to understand my position. Marcus Thornton is a prominent businessman with significant political connections. I can't just ride into Black Hollow and arrest him based on accusations from small ranchers who have obvious financial interest in stopping his land consolidation." Harriet felt her stomach sink. "So you won't help?" "I didn't say that." Crawford leaned forward. "What I will do is send a deputy to Black Hollow to investigate these claims. Interview witnesses, examine evidence, determine if there's enough to warrant federal charges. But that takes time, maybe 2 weeks, maybe more. And I need you to understand that if Thornton has the connections you say he does, this won't be simple. People are going to die while you're investigating," Harriet said flatly. "Thornton's not going to stop just because a deputy's asking questions." "Then you'd better hope your friends can hold out until we build a case strong enough to make charges stick." Crawford stood, signaling the meeting was over. "Leave your documentation with me. I'll start the process. But I can't promise you the outcome you want, Miss Calloway. The law doesn't always move as fast as justice requires." It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was all she was going to get. Harriet left the marshal's office and went to the newspaper, the Helena Independent. The editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Brennan, listened to her story with considerably more interest than Crawford had shown. "Cattle baron using illegal methods to consolidate power," Brennan said, already scribbling notes. "That's a hell of a story. But I'll need corroboration. Can't just print accusations. I have witnesses, 6 ranching families who'll testify to what Thornton's done." "Good. Give me names and I'll send a reporter to interview them. If their stories match yours, we'll run it front page." Brennan smiled grimly. "Nothing hurts rich men more than bad publicity. Thornton's building a reputation as a legitimate empire builder. Let's see how that holds up when people learn he's using thugs and arson." Harriet gave her all the information she could, then stumbled to the nearest boarding house and collapsed into sleep for the first time in 5 days. She woke 12 hours later to pounding on her door. "Telegram for Miss Calloway." Harriet's heart stopped. She scrambled to the door, took the telegram from the messenger with shaking hands. The message was brief, sent from Black Hollow's telegraph office. "Thornton moving tonight. Need you. Come fast. Or R." She didn't waste time packing, just grabbed her things, paid for the room, and ran to the stables where she'd left Ghost. The ride back to Black Hollow was brutal. She pushed Ghost harder than she should have, racing against time and distance and the terrible certainty that she was going to be too late. 2 days of hard riding brought her within sight of the valley. She crested the ridge overlooking Rhett's ranch just as the sun was setting, and saw smoke rising from the cabin. "Not again, please not again." She drove Ghost down the mountain slope, reckless and desperate, her rifle already in her hand. The cabin came into view. It wasn't fully burning, just smoking, like someone had tried to set it ablaze but the fire hadn't taken. The door hung open, no movement visible. Harriet dismounted before Ghost fully stopped, hitting the ground running. "Rhett!" She burst through the door and stopped cold. The cabin's interior was destroyed, furniture smashed, supplies scattered, blood on the floor. But no bodies.
No Rhett.
Looking for your mountain man?
Harriet spun. Thomas Webb stood in the doorway, flanked by 4 armed men.
Where is he?
Harriet demanded, raising her rifle.
Webb smiled. Somewhere safe, for now. Mr. Thornton thought it was time we had a conversation about the future of this valley and about what happens to people who don't know when to quit. He stepped into the cabin, his men spreading out to block the exits. Drop the rifle, Miss Calloway. You're outnumbered and outgunned. No need to make this uglier than it already is. Harriet's mind raced. 5 against 1. They'd already taken Rhett. If she fought, she'd die, and then nobody would be left to help him. Slowly, she lowered the rifle. Webb's smile widened. Smart girl. Now let's talk about how this ends. Webb's men tied Harriet's hands behind her back with rough efficiency, ignoring her protests. One of them picked up her rifle, another grabbed her saddlebags and began rifling through them. Looking for something? Harriet asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Just making sure you didn't bring back any unwanted attention from Helena, Webb said pleasantly. He nodded to the man searching her bags. Anything? Just supplies, no papers. Webb's expression tightened slightly. Where's the documentation? The logs you've been keeping of our activities? Left them with the territorial marshal, Harriet said, along with sworn statements from every rancher Thornton's threatened. It's all official now. Federal investigation's already started. It was a bluff. Crawford had promised an investigation, not started one. But Webb didn't need to know that. The pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something colder underneath. I see. Well, that complicates things. He studied her face. But not insurmountably. Federal investigations take months, sometimes years. Plenty of time for evidence to disappear, witnesses to change their minds, accidents to happen. Where's Rhett? Harriet demanded again. All in good time. Webb gestured to his men. Bring her. Mr. Thornton wants to meet the woman who's caused him so much trouble. They hauled her outside, lifted her onto Ghost despite her bound hands, and formed an escort around her. They rode south, away from the cabin, deeper into the valley. Harriet's mind raced, searching for options. Her hands were tied, she was outnumbered, and she had no idea where they were taking her or what condition Rhett was in. But she was still alive. That meant something. After an hour's ride, they approached a ranch Harriet had never seen before, massive compared to the small holding she knew, with multiple barns, corrals, and a house that looked like it belonged in Denver rather than the Montana wilderness. The Donovan Ranch, she realized. Now Thornton's headquarters. They brought her into the main house, through rooms furnished with expensive furniture and carpets that must have cost more than most ranchers made in a year. Finally, they reached a large office where a man sat behind an ornate desk, reviewing papers. Marcus Thornton looked nothing like Harriet had imagined. She'd pictured someone brutal, obviously cruel. Instead, he was refined, late 40s, well-dressed, with the kind of face that belonged to a banker or lawyer, the kind of man who could order terrible things without ever raising his voice. He looked up when they entered, set down his pen, and studied Harriet with cool interest. Miss Calloway, I've heard a great deal about you. His voice was cultured, Eastern. Please sit. I'll stand. Thornton smiled slightly. Defiant to the end. I can respect that. But it's also exhausting, don't you think? All this resistance when the outcome was never in doubt. He gestured to a chair. Sit. You've had a long ride. One of Webb's men shoved her into the chair. Harriet bit back a curse. Better, Thornton said. Now, let's discuss your situation. You've been to Helena, spoken with Marshal Crawford, made accusations against my business practices. That was foolish, but understandable. You're desperate, grasping at any authority that might help you. Where's Rhett Maddox? Alive. For now. Whether he remains that way depends largely on how this conversation proceeds. Thornton leaned back in his chair. You see, Miss Calloway, I've built something remarkable here. A cattle empire that will supply beef to half the Western Territory. It's ambitious, yes, but ambition requires difficult decisions, sacrifices, and occasionally removing obstacles. You mean murdering people who won't sell to you? Murder is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as accelerating inevitable outcomes. This valley will be mine. That's simple economics. Small ranchers like Maddox can't compete with my resources, my scale, my vision. Eventually they'd fail anyway. I'm simply speeding up the process. By burning barns and stealing cattle. By acquiring assets that were being underutilized. Thornton's expression didn't change. But I didn't bring you here to debate ethics. I brought you here to offer you a choice. Harriet waited. Your documentation with Marshall Crawford is problematic but manageable. Federal investigations move slowly, and I have friends in Helena who can ensure this one moves even slower. The newspaper story is more concerning. Bad publicity can damage my reputation. So here's what I propose. You convince your rancher friends to drop their complaints, tell the newspaper you were mistaken, and this all goes away. In return, I'll let you and Maddox leave Montana alive. You'll have enough money to start over somewhere else. And if I refuse, then Rhett Maddox dies tonight, and his death gets blamed on you. A lover's quarrel gone wrong, perhaps. Or maybe he discovered you were stealing from him and confronted you. Sheriff Keller will find plenty of evidence to support whatever story we decide to tell. Thornton's voice remained pleasant, conversational. After that, your rancher coalition falls apart. They won't keep fighting without Maddox or you to hold them together. They'll sell to me or face the same consequences. Either way, I get this valley. You're insane. I'm practical, and I'm giving you more mercy than you deserve. Take the offer, Miss Calloway. Walk away while you still can. Harriet's mind spun. If she agreed, Rhett lived, but everything they'd fought for was lost. If she refused, Thornton would kill them both and destroy any evidence connecting him to the crimes. She needed time. Time to think, to plan, to find a way out of this. I want to see Rhett first, she said. I want to know he's alive before I agree to anything. Thornton considered this, then nodded. Reasonable. Webb, take her to the barn. Let her see Maddox, give her 10 minutes to say goodbye, then bring her back. They hauled Harriet out of the office, across the yard to a large barn on the property's edge. Inside, lit by a single lantern, she saw Rhett. He was tied to a support post, his face bruised and bleeding, one eye swollen shut. But he was conscious, and when he saw her, something fierce sparked in his good eye. Harriet, you shouldn't have come back. Like I was going to leave you. She turned to Webb. Untie me. You can watch us the whole time, but let me at least check his injuries. Webb hesitated, then nodded. One of his men cut the ropes binding her wrists. Harriet immediately went to Rhett, kneeling beside him to examine the damage. Broken ribs, she thought. Split lip. Possible concussion from the head wound above his eye. How bad? Rhett asked quietly. You've had worse. She kept her voice low, aware of Webb and his men watching. Helena Marshall's investigating. Newspapers running the story. Help is coming. Not fast enough. Rhett's voice was barely a whisper. They're planning something tonight. Heard them talking. Something about cleaning up loose ends and ending this for good. Harriet's stomach dropped. Thornton offered us a deal. Retract everything, leave Montana, live. You didn't take it. Not yet. She met his eyes. But Rhett, if we don't... We don't. His voice was steel despite the injuries. We've come too far. Those other ranchers are counting on us. If we fold now, Thornton wins everything. He'll keep doing this in every valley, every territory, until nobody can stop him. He'll kill us. Probably. Rhett managed a broken smile. But we'll make it expensive for him. Harriet looked at this man who'd pulled her from a blizzard, taught her to survive, given her a partnership when the world said she was worthless. This man who'd rather die than surrender to bullies and thieves. She loved him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Not the desperate gratitude she'd felt after the rescue, not the respect that had grown through working together. Real love. The kind that made you willing to fight impossible odds, to stand beside someone even when walking away would be easier. I love you, she said quietly. Figured you should know that, in case we don't get another chance to talk. Rhett's expression softened despite the pain. I know. I've known for a while. I love you too. He paused. Which is why I need you to take Thornton's deal. What? No! Listen to me. You take the deal. Get out of here. Go back to Helena. Tell Crawford and the newspaper everything. Make sure the truth comes out, even if I'm not around to see it. That matters more than what happens to me. I'm not leaving you to die. You're not. You're making sure my death means something. Rhett shifted, wincing at the pain. One of us needs to survive this, Harriet. One of us needs to make sure Thornton pays for what he's done. And that's you. Time's up, Webb called from the barn entrance. Say your goodbyes. Harriet leaned close to Rhett, pressing her forehead against his. I'm not leaving you, she whispered, so we better figure out how to survive this together. She felt him tense, about to argue, then relax slightly. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. You say that like it's a bad thing. Webb's men grabbed her, pulled her away from Rhett. She didn't resist as they tied her hands again and marched her back toward the house. But her mind was working, racing through options and possibilities. Thornton wanted her cooperation to make his problems disappear cleanly. That gave her leverage. Not much, but some. And somewhere out there, Marshall Crawford was starting an investigation. The Helena newspaper was preparing to run a story. The other ranchers knew what was happening. Help was coming. They just had to survive long enough for it to arrive. Webb brought her back to Thornton's office. The cattle baron looked up from his papers expectantly. Have you made your decision, Miss Calloway? Harriet met his eyes. I need more than your word that Rhett and I will be allowed to leave safely. I need guarantees. Such as? Written agreements transferring property titles legally, not through fraud. Safe passage to the territorial line with witnesses. And payment up front, not promises of money later. Thornton smiled. You're negotiating. I like that. Shows intelligence. He pulled out fresh paper, began writing. I can have legal documents prepared by tomorrow morning, payment in bank draft, cashable in any Western territory. Safe passage guaranteed by... He paused. How about Sheriff Keller himself? He's a trusted lawman. His word should be sufficient. Keller's in your pocket, which means you can trust him to do exactly what I tell him to do, including ensuring your safety. Thornton finished writing, looked up. Those are my terms. Agree now, and by this time tomorrow, you and Maddox will be free to start your new lives elsewhere. It was a lie. Harriet knew it was a lie. The moment she signed anything, the moment she retracted her statements, Thornton would have no reason to keep them alive. But she nodded slowly. I'll need to discuss this with Rhett. Make sure he agrees. Of course. Webb will take you back to the barn. You have 1 hour to convince him. After that, Thornton's expression hardened. After that, my patience expires and we resolve this the other way. Webb escorted her back to the barn, but this time he didn't untie her hands. Just shoved her inside and closed the door, leaving 2 armed guards outside. Harriet knelt beside Rhett again. We've got maybe an hour before they kill us both. Any ideas? Several, none of them good. Rhett tested his bonds, still tight. How many men you see on the property? At least a dozen, maybe more. Harriet looked around the barn, searching for anything useful. Tools hung on the far wall, but with guards outside and her hands bound, reaching them would be impossible. We're outgunned and outnumbered. Story of our lives lately. Rhett managed a painful laugh. But we're not out yet. That lantern, can you reach it? Harriet stretched toward the lantern sitting on a barrel near the door. Her fingers just barely grasped the handle. Got it. What are you thinking? Thinking fire got us into this mess. Maybe fire gets us out. Rhett nodded toward the hay bales stacked against the barn's far wall. Thornton's got a fortune in horses and equipment in here. Barn goes up, creates chaos. In the confusion, maybe we get a chance. Maybe we also burn to death. I said it wasn't a good idea. He looked at her seriously. But it's the only play we've got. Unless you want to trust Thornton's word. Harriet looked at the lantern in her bound hands, then at the hay, then at the door where armed men waited. It was insane, reckless, likely to get them both killed. But Rhett was right. It was the only play they had. All right, she said, let's burn it down. She carried the lantern to the hay bales, moving as quietly as she could. Her hands shook, partly from fear, partly from the awkward angle of working with bound wrists. She fumbled with the lantern's glass, finally got it open, and tilted it until oil spilled onto the dry hay. The hay caught instantly, flames spreading with terrifying speed. Now what? Harriet asked as smoke began filling the barn. Now we start screaming for help and hope those guards are more interested in saving Thornton's property than watching us. They both started yelling, Fire! The barn's on fire! The door burst open. The 2 guards rushed in, saw the flames spreading across the hay bales, and panic replaced their vigilance. One ran for water buckets. The others started trying to lead the panicked horses out of their stalls. In the chaos, neither noticed Rhett working his wrists against the ropes holding him to the post. The fire had weakened the wood. It was old, dry, starting to catch from the nearby flames. "Come on," he muttered, straining. The post creaked. The ropes cut into his wrists, drawing blood, but he kept pulling. The post snapped. Rhett surged to his feet despite his injuries, grabbed a shovel from the wall, and swung it into the nearest guard's head. The man went down hard. The second guard spun around, reaching for his gun, but Harriet was already moving. She kicked his knee hard, just like Rhett had taught her during their months of working together, and he stumbled. Rhett hit him with the shovel before he could recover. "Out!" Rhett gasped, grabbing Harriet's arm. "Before the whole thing comes down." They ran from the barn as flames consumed it behind them. Outside, chaos had erupted. Men were running with buckets, trying to contain the fire. Others were releasing horses from nearby corrals, keeping them from panicking and breaking through fences. Nobody was watching two fugitives stumble toward the tree line. They made it maybe 50 yards before someone shouted, "They're escaping! Stop them!" Gunfire cracked across the yard. Harriet felt a bullet whip past her head, heard Rhett grunt beside her. He stumbled but kept moving, dragging her toward the darkness beyond Thornton's compound. They hit the trees and kept running, branches whipping their faces, roots trying to trip them. Behind them, voices shouted and torches bobbed in the darkness as Thornton's men organized pursuit. "Can't outrun them," Rhett panted. "Not with my ribs. You go. I'll slow them down." "Not a chance." Harriet pulled him deeper into the forest. "We survive together, or not at all." They crashed through underbrush, Harriet leading now because Rhett was slowing down, his breathing labored. She could feel warmth spreading across his side where she gripped his arm. Blood, probably from a wound she hadn't seen in the barn. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. They needed to hide, to rest, but there was nowhere. A hand grabbed Harriet from the darkness. She opened her mouth to scream, but another hand clamped over it. "Quiet," a familiar voice hissed. John Henderson stepped into view, lowered his hand. "It's us." Behind him, Harriet saw Jacob McClellan, Porter's son, and 3 other men from the Rancher Coalition, all armed, all grim-faced. "How?" Harriet started. "Got your telegram," Henderson said quickly. "Figured you'd need backup. We've been watching Thornton's ranch all evening, waiting for a chance." He looked at Rhett's injuries, the blood. "Good thing we did." "They're coming," Rhett warned. "Let them come." McClellan raised his rifle. "We're tired of running." The ranchers spread out, taking positions behind trees and rocks. Harriet helped Rhett down behind cover, finally got a look at his side. A bullet had grazed his ribs, painful, but not fatal if they could stop the bleeding. Thornton's men crashed into the clearing, torches held high. Webb was leading them, his pleasant mask completely gone. "Give it up, Maddox! You're surrounded!" "Funny," Henderson called out. "We were about to say the same thing to you." The torchlight revealed the ranchers positioned in a defensive line, rifles aimed. Webb's men stopped, realizing they'd walked into an ambush. "You're making a mistake," Webb said, though his voice had lost its confidence. "Mr. Thornton will answer for what he's done," Jacob McClellan interrupted. "And so will you. Every crime, every threat, every piece of land stolen through violence. It's all documented. Federal marshals coming, newspapers running the story tomorrow. Your operation is finished." "You think hiding behind the law will save you?" Webb's hand moved toward his gun. "We'll see about—" "Nobody move!" The new voice came from the darkness beyond the torches. Sheriff Keller stepped into view, flanked by 6 deputies. But behind them came someone else, Marshal Crawford, along with 2 federal agents. Everyone froze. Crawford surveyed the scene, the burning barn visible in the distance, the armed standoff, Rhett's injuries, Harriet's bound wrists. "Thomas Webb," Crawford said formally, "you're under arrest for arson, assault, and attempted murder. Federal charges." He looked at the hired guns. "Drop your weapons, all of you." "You can't," Webb started. "I can and I am. We've been investigating Marcus Thornton's operations for 3 weeks. Ever since Miss Calloway came to Helena, I've had agents gathering evidence. The newspaper story forced our hand. Had to move tonight before more people got killed." Crawford's voice was hard. "Now drop your weapons, or add resisting arrest to your charges." One by one, Webb's men complied. Keller stepped forward, and Harriet tensed, expecting him to side with Thornton, but instead he looked at Crawford. "What about Thornton himself?" "In custody back at his ranch," Crawford said. "We arrested him 10 minutes ago. Found enough evidence in his office to convict him 10 times over, ledgers detailing every illegal transaction, letters proving conspiracy to commit arson and murder. The man kept records of his own crimes. He shook his head. Rich men always think they're too important to face consequences. Harriet felt something break open in her chest, relief so intense it made her dizzy. They'd won. Against all odds, they'd actually won. Henderson cut the ropes from her wrists while one of Crawford's agents examined Rhett's injuries. The federal marshal walked over to Harriet. "That was brave, what you did. Coming to Helena, standing up to Thornton. A lot of people would have just run." "Running doesn't fix problems," Harriet said. "Just moves them somewhere else." Crawford nodded. "For what it's worth, your documentation made the case possible. Without those detailed logs, we'd have had nothing solid to go on." He paused. "There'll be a trial. You and Maddox will need to testify. Could take months." "We'll be there," Harriet said. She went to Rhett, who was being bandaged by one of the ranchers. Despite his injuries, he was smiling. "We did it," he said quietly. "We did." He reached for her hand, squeezed it. "Thank you for not leaving me, for burning down Thornton's barn, for being stubborn enough to fight. Thank you for teaching me how." Around them, the ranchers were celebrating, quiet, exhausted celebration, but real. They'd stood together against impossible odds and won. Their valley was safe. Their homes were safe. The cost had been high. Property destroyed, people injured, months of terror and violence. But they'd survived. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Harriet watched the sun paint the peaks gold and realized something fundamental had changed. Not just in the valley, but in herself. She wasn't the frightened woman who'd arrived in Black Hollow 6 months ago, desperate for acceptance and terrified of rejection. She was someone who'd fought for what mattered, who'd built something real, who'd learned that strength wasn't about fitting other people's expectations. It was about refusing to break when they told you you should. Rhett squeezed her hand again. "Ready to go home?" Home. The cabin in the mountains. The ranch they'd built together. The partnership that had become something deeper. "Yeah," Harriet said, "let's go home." The ride back to the cabin took longer than it should have. Rhett's injuries forced them to move slowly, and twice they had to stop so he could rest. But Harriet didn't mind. For the first time in months, they weren't running from anything. The danger had passed. Thornton was in federal custody. His hired guns were scattered or arrested. The valley was theirs again. When they finally reached the mountain property, the destruction hit Harriet harder than she'd expected. The cabin's door hung crooked on broken hinges. Inside, furniture lay smashed, supplies scattered across the floor, months of work undone in a single night of violence. "We can rebuild," Rhett said quietly, reading her expression. "Done it before." "I know." Harriet picked up an overturned chair, set it upright. "Doesn't make it less frustrating to see." "No, it doesn't." They spent the rest of that day cleaning up what they could. Rhett worked despite Harriet's protests about his injuries, insisting that keeping busy helped more than resting. By evening, they'd restored some semblance of order, enough to sleep without feeling like they were camping in ruins. That night, sitting by a fire they'd built in the repaired hearth, Rhett finally asked the question Harriet had been expecting. "What happens now? After the trial? After everything settles? You staying in Montana?" Harriet looked at him across the flames. His face was still bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, but his expression was serious, vulnerable in a way she rarely saw. "Where else would I go?" she asked. "Chicago, back east. Somewhere easier than this." He gestured at the damaged cabin. "This valley nearly killed you 6 times. Nobody would blame you for wanting something different." "Would you want me to go?" "Hell no." The answer came fast, certain. "But I'm not going to ask you to stay just because I want you here. You've earned the right to choose your own path, Harriet, not have it chosen for you by circumstance or obligation." She studied him, this scarred mountain rancher who'd taught her to survive, to fight, to believe she was worth more than the world had told her, who'd given her partnership when others offered only pity, who loved her enough to let her go if that's what she needed. "I choose here," she said simply. "I choose this valley, this ranch, this life. And I choose you." Something shifted in Rhett's expression, relief and joy and gratitude all mixed together. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Harriet moved around the fire to sit beside him. "Everything I ran from in Chicago, The judgment, the mockery, the constant feeling that I was wrong for existing, none of that exists here. Here I'm just Harriet, a rancher, your partner, someone who fought for her home and won. She took his hand. That's worth more than any easy life back east could ever be. Rhett pulled her close, careful of his broken ribs. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither of them speaking. Sometimes words weren't necessary. The next week brought a steady stream of visitors. The Henderson family came first, bringing food and offering help with repairs. Mary Henderson hugged Harriet like they were old friends, which Harriet supposed they were now. Shared danger had a way of forging bonds faster than years of casual acquaintance. Jacob McClellan showed up with his sons and a wagon full of lumber. "Figure you'll need materials to rebuild," he said gruffly. "No sense in you paying for it when Thornton's the one who caused the damage. Consider it a loan from the valley. You can pay us back with beef once your herd recovers." Even families who'd sold to Thornton before the arrest stopped by to apologize. "We didn't know how bad it was," one man said, hat in his hands. "Thought we were just taking a good business deal. Didn't realize we were helping a criminal run good people off their land." "You were scared," Rhett said, surprising Harriet with his generosity. "Can't fault anyone for protecting their families. But now you know better. Next time someone tries to consolidate power through fear, you'll recognize it faster." The man nodded, relieved to be forgiven. Marshal Crawford came by 2 weeks after the arrests, bringing news. Thornton's trial is set for September in Helena. Federal prosecutors built a solid case. We've got him on racketeering, arson, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal land seizure. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison if the jury convicts. "If?" Harriet asked. "Rich men have good lawyers," Crawford said, "but the evidence is overwhelming, and the newspaper coverage has been brutal. Half the territory knows what he did. Hard to buy your way out when the whole country's watching." He paused. "You'll both need to testify. Your accounts are central to the prosecution." "We'll be there," Rhett said. After Crawford left, Harriet found herself thinking about the trial, about having to relive everything in front of strangers, about Thornton sitting there in his expensive suit, probably still believing he'd done nothing wrong. "You worried about testifying?" Rhett asked that evening. "A little. Not about telling the truth. I can do that easy enough. More about," she struggled to find words, "about him. About men like him who think money and power mean they can take whatever they want without consequences. What if the jury believes him instead of us?" "Then we'll know the system's more broken than we thought," Rhett said. "But Harriet, whatever happens at that trial, we've already won the part that matters. We kept our home. We proved that small people standing together can fight big power and survive. That's not nothing." He was right, but it still felt incomplete. Like the story wouldn't truly be over until Thornton faced real justice. Spring turned to summer and the valley transformed. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadows. The remaining cattle grew fat on fresh grass. Harriet and Rhett rebuilt the cabin piece by piece, making it better than before. Stronger walls, better insulation, a real kitchen area instead of just the fireplace. They worked in comfortable rhythm, their partnership deepening into something neither of them bothered to define. Some nights, Rhett still slept in the loft, maintaining propriety. Other nights he didn't, and Harriet wasn't about to feel ashamed about that. They were adults building a life together. The details were nobody's business but theirs. In June, a letter arrived from Catherine Brennan at the Helena Independent. Harriet opened it while Rhett was checking the fence line. The letter was brief but powerful. Brennan had run a series of articles about Thornton's crimes, and the response had been overwhelming. Readers across Montana and beyond were demanding stricter regulations on land consolidation, better protection for small ranchers, federal oversight of territorial sheriffs. The story had sparked a conversation about power and justice that was spreading far beyond their small valley. "We changed something," Harriet said when Rhett returned and she showed him the letter. "Not just here, everywhere." "You changed something," Rhett corrected. "You're the one who rode to Helena, who documented everything, who refused to give up even when it would have been easier." "We changed it together." Harriet folded the letter carefully. "That's what partnership means." In August, they received word that Sheriff Boone Keller had been removed from office. A federal review of his conduct revealed years of corruption, bribery, and deliberate negligence. The new sheriff, a woman named Alice Brenner, who'd spent 15 years as a deputy marshal in Wyoming, rode out to their ranch personally to introduce herself.
Heard you two are the reason I've got this job, she said, dismounting near the cabin. Figured I should meet the people who cleaned up this valley.
We just wanted to keep our home, Harriet said. Sometimes that's enough.
Brenner accepted the coffee Rhett offered. For what it's worth, I'm not interested in looking the other way for anyone, rich or poor, powerful or not. The law applies equally, or it doesn't mean anything. That's all we ever wanted, Rhett said.
Brenner stayed for an hour, asking questions about the valley, the ranchers, the history that had led to Thornton's crimes. When she left, Harriet felt something settle in her chest. Hope, maybe. That things really could be different now. September arrived with the first hint of autumn in the air. The trial was set for the second week of the month. Harriet and Rhett rode to Helena together, along with the Hendersons, McClellans, and 3 other ranching families who'd agreed to testify. The territorial courthouse was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, taking notes. Citizens who'd read about the case crowded the benches. And at the defendant's table sat Marcus Thornton, looking smaller somehow without his ranch and his hired guns around him. The trial lasted 4 days. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, the ledgers found in Thornton's office, testimony from Webb and other hired men who'd turned on their employer in exchange for reduced sentences, and the accounts from Harriet, Rhett, and the other ranchers. Harriet testified on the second day. Walking to the witness stand, she felt every eye in the courtroom on her, judging, assessing, wondering if this heavy-set woman from Chicago could really have stood up to a cattle baron. She took the oath and told the truth. Everything. The barn burning, the stolen cattle, the threats, the night Webb's men had tied her up and brought her to Thornton's ranch. She spoke clearly, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. Thornton's lawyer tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she'd exaggerated events to justify taking what didn't belong to her. But Harriet had documentation for everything. Dates, times, witnesses. The lawyer's attacks fell flat. Rhett testified the next day, describing years of harassment, the murder of his horse, his own beating and imprisonment. His testimony was quieter than Harriet's, but no less powerful. Here was a man who'd survived in brutal country through strength and skill, brought low by organized crime dressed up as business. On the 4th day, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Journalists rushed for the doors to file their stories. Spectators cheered. Thornton sat motionless, his expression blank, as the judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison. Outside the courthouse, Harriet found herself surrounded by reporters asking questions. How did it feel to take down a cattle baron? What message did she have for other small ranchers facing similar pressure? Did she consider herself a hero? I'm not a hero, Harriet said firmly. I'm just someone who refused to let fear make my decisions. And I'm not the only one. There are 6 other ranching families who stood up when it would have been easier to hide. They're the real story. But the newspapers didn't see it that way. The next day's headlines told a different tale. Woman who saved a valley. Chicago rancher's courage brings down corrupt empire. From outcast to champion, Harriet Calloway's fight for justice. Thornton Falls. How one woman's refusal to surrender exposed years of crime. Harriet read them with mixed feelings. The attention made her uncomfortable, but if it meant other people in similar situations would find courage to fight back, maybe it was worth the discomfort. They rode back to Black Hollow at a leisurely pace, taking time to appreciate the country they'd fought so hard to keep. The mountains looked different now, less threatening, more like home. When they reached town, something had changed there too. People who'd previously looked at Harriet with pity or disdain now nodded respectfully when she passed. Mrs. Crawford actually smiled and offered her a discount at the boarding house restaurant. Emily Sutton crossed the street to avoid her, which Harriet considered an improvement over the pointed comments. You're famous now, Rhett observed as they rode toward the mountain. Famous is too strong a word. Notorious, maybe. Either way, you've proven something. He looked at her seriously. You've proven that women like you, women who don't fit the mold, can not only survive out here, but thrive, lead, change things. Women like me, Harriet repeated. You mean fat women? I mean strong women, stubborn women, women who refuse to be less than they are just because it makes other people comfortable. Rhett reached over, took her hand. Though, for what it's worth, I never saw you as fat. I just saw you as Harriet. Partner, fighter, the woman I love. Harriet felt tears prick her eyes. Good tears, the kind that came from being seen completely and accepted anyway. I love you too, even when you're being sentimental. I'm not sentimental. I'm practical. Practically in love with you. She laughed, and they rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. The cabin looked better than it had before the attack. The new construction was solid, weatherproof. They'd added windows that let in more light. The kitchen actually had proper shelves and a work table. It felt permanent in a way the old cabin never had. That night, as they sat outside watching stars emerge over the mountains, Rhett said quietly, "I want to marry you." Harriet turned to look at him. That a question or a statement? Bit of both, I guess. He was nervous, she realized. This scarred mountain rancher who'd faced down hired guns without flinching was nervous about asking her to marry him. "I know marriage might not matter much to you. We're already partners, already building a life together. But I want it on record. I want everyone to know that you're my wife, that this ranch is ours together, that what we've built here is permanent." "Yes," Harriet said. Rhett blinked. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you, though I have conditions." "Of course you do. Equal partnership on paper, both our names on the property deed, both of us with legal say in ranch decisions. I'm not going to be a wife in name only to have legal rights to nothing." She held up a second finger. "And we get married here, in this valley, with the people who fought beside us. Not in some church with people who judged us." "Those aren't conditions. Those are exactly what I wanted too." Rhett pulled her close. "Equal partners, legal and otherwise. Always." They married in October when the aspens turned gold. Sheriff Brenner performed the ceremony under open sky, with the Henderson family, the McClellans, and a dozen other ranching families as witnesses. No fancy clothes, no elaborate ceremony. Just two people making promises they intended to keep, surrounded by the land they'd fought to protect. Mary Henderson cried happy tears. Jacob McClellan made a gruff toast about stubborn people making the best partners. Someone had brought whiskey, and someone else had brought a fiddle, and the celebration lasted well into the night. When the last guests finally left, Harriet and Rhett stood together looking at their valley bathed in moonlight. "Think we'll ever have a quiet life?" Harriet asked. "Probably not. We're too stubborn for quiet." Rhett wrapped an arm around her waist. "But whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." "Together," Harriet agreed. That winter was harsh, but they were prepared. The reinforced cabin held against the worst storms. The cattle they'd slowly rebuilt their herd with survived in the protected valleys. And when spring came again, Harriet realized she'd been in Montana for a full year. A year ago, she'd been a frightened woman running from everything she'd ever known, convinced she had no place in the world. Now she had a home, a husband, a purpose, and a reputation that reached far beyond their small valley. But the best part wasn't the fame or the victory over Thornton. The best part was waking up every morning knowing she belonged exactly where she was. Not because someone else said so, but because she'd built this life with her own hands and defended it with her own courage. In March, a letter arrived from the Women's Suffrage Association in Denver. They'd read about Harriet's story and wanted her to speak at their convention about women's rights and Western opportunities. "You should go," Rhett said when she showed him the invitation. "I'm not a public speaker." "You testified in front of a packed courtroom and took down a cattle baron. Pretty sure you can handle a convention." He smiled. "Besides, maybe other women need to hear that the frontier isn't just for men who fit a certain mold, that there's room out here for everyone willing to work and fight for their place." Harriet went to Denver in April. Standing before 300 women from across the Western territories, she told her story simply and honestly. About being judged her whole life for her size. About coming west hoping to disappear. About finding strength she didn't know she had when circumstances demanded it. "The frontier didn't make me strong," she told the assembled women. "It just gave me permission to be as strong as I already was. Back east, strength in a woman, especially a woman who looks like me, is seen as unfeminine, inappropriate. Out here, strength is just survival. And once I stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped trying to be smaller to make other people comfortable, I found out I could do things I never imagined." She paused, looking at the faces watching her. Women of all ages, all backgrounds, all seeking something similar to what she'd found. You don't need permission to be strong. You don't need anyone's approval to build the life you want. You just need the courage to start and the stubbornness to keep going when people tell you to quit. The West doesn't care if you're big or small, pretty or plain, rich or poor. It only cares if you can survive. And survival, real survival, starts with refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, dozens of women approached her with stories of their own struggles, their own dreams of heading west, their own fears about whether they'd be accepted. "You did it," they said. "If you can do it, maybe we can too." Harriet told them all the same thing. "You can, but it won't be easy, and it won't be what you expect. The frontier's brutal and beautiful and completely indifferent to your plans. But if you're willing to adapt, to learn, to fight for what matters, there's room for you here." She returned to Montana a week later, exhausted but satisfied. Rhett met her at the train station in Helena, and the smile on his face when he saw her made the whole trip worth it. "How'd it go?" he asked as they rode home. "I think I convinced a few women they're stronger than they thought." "You're good at that." Rhett reached over, squeezed her hand. "You convinced me I didn't have to be alone up in those mountains, that trusting someone again was worth the risk." "Was it?" "Best decision I ever made." They rode back to their valley as spring turned the mountains green and wildflowers bloomed across the meadows. The ranch was thriving now. They'd built their herd back up to 40 head, repaired all the buildings, even started planning an expansion. Other changes were happening too. 2 families who'd left during Thornton's reign of terror had returned, reclaiming their abandoned homesteads. New settlers were arriving, drawn by newspaper stories about the valley that had stood up to corruption. The community was growing, strengthening. In June, Mary Henderson rode up to the cabin with news that she was pregnant again. "Wanted you to be one of the first to know," she said. "Feels like a good sign, you know? Bringing new life into a valley that almost got destroyed." Harriet hugged her friend, thinking about beginnings and endings, about how life moved forward even after terrible things happened. About resilience. That summer, Harriet started keeping a journal. Not documentation of crimes like before, but just everyday observations. The weather, the cattle, the small moments that made up a life. Future generations might want to know what it was really like, she thought. Not the dramatic parts that made headlines, but the quiet work of building something that lasted. One entry in late July read, "Rhett and I spent today repairing the north fence line. Hard work, but satisfying. He's still terrible at small talk, but his silence is comfortable now rather than awkward. We've learned each other's rhythms. Partnership isn't about never disagreeing. We argue plenty. It's about trusting that disagreements don't mean the end of everything, that we can fight and still be on the same side." Another entry in August, "Letter from Catherine Brennan today. She's writing a book about women in the Western Territories and wants to include my story. I said yes, but only if she tells the whole truth, the fear, the mistakes, the times I nearly gave up. Heroic legends don't help anyone. Honest stories about flawed people who succeeded anyway, those might actually be useful." As autumn arrived again, Harriet stood on the ridge overlooking their valley and took stock of everything they'd built. A working ranch, a home, a community of families who looked out for each other. A marriage built on respect and trust as much as love. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she left Chicago. It was better, harder, but better. "You look thoughtful," Rhett said, joining her on the ridge. "Just thinking about how far we've come. A year and a half ago, I was lost in a blizzard, certain I was going to die. Now look at us." "You were never really lost," Rhett said. "Just taking the long way home." Harriet leaned against him, this man who'd saved her life and then taught her how to save herself. Who'd given her partnership and space to grow. Who loved her not despite who she was, but because of it. Below them, smoke rose from chimneys across the valley. The Henderson place, the McClellans, the new families who'd settled after Thornton's fall. A community, built on the ruins of what corrupt men had tried to destroy. "Think our story's over?" Harriet asked. "No story's ever really over. Just reaches new chapters." Rhett pulled her closer. "But if you're asking whether the dramatic part's done, yeah, I think so. From here it's just the slow work of living, building, maintaining, growing old together." Sounds perfect. And it was. Not perfect in the fairy tale sense. There would be hard winters, failed crops, disagreements, and setbacks. Life on the frontier didn't suddenly become easy just because you'd won one battle. But it was perfect in the way that mattered, perfect because they'd chosen it, perfect because they'd fought for it, Perfect because every morning Harriet woke up knowing she belonged exactly where she was. The woman who'd arrived in Black Hollow 18 months ago, frightened, uncertain, running from judgment, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage, that taking up space wasn't something to apologize for, that the frontier had room for everyone willing to earn their place. Years later, when people told the story of how the Montana Valley was saved from a corrupt cattle baron, they'd focus on the dramatic parts: the burned barn, the midnight escape, the federal trial. But Harriet knew the real story was quieter than that. It was about a woman who refused to shrink herself to fit other people's expectations, about a scarred rancher who learned to trust again, about ordinary people standing together against extraordinary power and discovering they were stronger than they'd ever imagined. It was about partnership, real partnership, built on respect and hard work, and the stubborn refusal to give up when things got difficult. And it was about home, not a place you're born into or inherit, but something you build with your own hands and defend with everything you have. Something that belongs to you because you've earned it. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, Harriet Maddox stood beside her husband and looked at the life they'd created. They'd started as two broken people the world had rejected. Now they were partners, ranchers, defenders of a valley that bore their mark. The frontier hadn't made them who they were. It had just given them the space to become it. And that, Harriet thought as stars began to emerge overhead, was exactly enough.